Chapter 21. Ryder. The room didn't erupt the way Ryder might have expected. There was no shouting, no fists slamming tables, and no immediate calls for blood. Instead, the clubhouse went unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that meant every man present was replaying the same realization in his head, that the past they thought they understood had been built on a fracture none of them had seen coming. Ryder stood at the center of it, hands braced on the table, letting the truth Ghost had revealed settle where it needed to land. He watched his brothers carefully, recognizing the subtle tells that meant more than words ever could. Jax's jaw was locked tight, anger coiled, waiting for release. Cash had gone still, eyes distant as he recalculated years of numbers and decisions with new context. Blaze leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, gaze hard and distant, already thinking about retaliation, even if it hadn't been ordered yet. No one interrupted. That alone told Ryder they understood the gravity of what they were facing. Ryder finally straightened, his presence grounding the room the way it always had in moments like this. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This isn't a theory," he said. "It's documented. It reaches back further than most of you have been patched." He let that land before continuing. "And it ends here. Tonight." The silence held. "The lie lived long," he continued, "because we let ourselves believe in clean endings. We don't get that luxury anymore. What we get is the truth, and what we do with it is what defines us." He made it clear that what mattered wasn't how long the lie had lived, but what they chose to do with it now. The Blood Reapers had always survived by refusing to turn on themselves, by facing threats as a unified front. This truth tested that philosophy, but Ryder refused to let it dismantle them. He reminded them that loyalty wasn't proven by pretending the past was clean. It was proven by confronting it together. Blaze was the first to speak. "So what do we do with it?" "We use it," Ryder said. "We don't react. We don't scatter. We absorb this and we move smarter than we ever have." "And the Scorpions?" Jax asked, voice controlled but barely. "They're watching for instability." Ryder held his gaze. "We don't give it to them. Every action from here goes through me, coordinated and calculated. Anyone who moves alone answers for it." No one pushed back. That was its own kind of answer. As the discussion deepened, Ryder felt the weight of leadership settle heavier across his shoulders. This wasn't just about the Scorpions anymore. It was about reclaiming ownership of their own history. The betrayal tied directly into decisions made years ago, decisions that had cost lives, territory, and trust. Ryder accepted his share of that burden without deflection. A president didn't hide behind ignorance, even when the truth had been deliberately concealed. He turned to Ghost then, directly, not as a subordinate, but as a brother whose role had just shifted permanently. "You carried this alone longer than you should have had to," Ryder said. "That's on me as much as anyone." He held Ghost's eyes. "It doesn't happen that way again. What you know, we know. That's how this works from now on." Ghost inclined his head once. The restraint in that single gesture said more than most men managed in a full sentence. The reaction across the room wasn't dramatic, but it was solid. Nods followed, eye contact held. Whatever shock lingered was being replaced by something steadier. Ryder recognized it instantly. This was the moment the club chose whether the past would poison them or sharpen them. And the Blood Reapers had never been a club that folded under pressure. As the meeting began to wind down, Ryder laid out the immediate priorities. No reckless moves, no independent retaliation. Every action would be cleared, coordinated, and calculated. The Scorpions wanted chaos. Ryder intended to give them discipline instead, the kind that closed traps quietly and left no room for escape. When he dismissed the room, he stayed where he was, watching his brothers file out with purpose instead of uncertainty. That mattered. The truth had rocked them, but it hadn't cracked their foundation. If anything, it had reinforced why the Blood Reapers had survived as long as they had. They didn't run from the ugly parts of their story. They faced them head-on and kept moving forward. Ryder exhaled slowly once he was alone, the weight of command settling into something resolute rather than crushing. This chapter of their history was far from over, but the direction was set. The past had reached up to demand acknowledgement, and Ryder had answered it with control, clarity, and unity. Whatever came next, the Blood Reapers would meet it together. He remained alone at the table long after the last of his brothers disappeared down the hall, the echo of boots fading into the steady hum of the clubhouse settling around him. The quiet wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't chaotic either. It was the kind of silence that followed truth, heavy, reflective, and demanding action. He welcomed it. Silence gave him room to think, and right now, every decision mattered. He replayed the meeting in his head, scrutinizing each reaction, each pause, each unspoken question. The club had taken the revelation better than he'd expected, but Ryder knew that shock had a way of resurfacing later, usually in private moments when anger and grief had time to ferment. That was when mistakes were made. He intended to stay ahead of that curve, keeping his brothers focused on the future instead of letting them spiral into resentment over the past. His thoughts shifted briefly to Ghost, whose role had quietly evolved from observer to linchpin. Ryder respected the hell out of him for carrying that secret without letting it poison his loyalty or cloud his judgment. That kind of restraint wasn't common in their world. Ryder made a mental note to reinforce Ghost's position publicly, not as a reward, but as a signal. The club needed to understand that truth-tellers were protected, not punished. As Ryder moved toward the bar, he poured himself a drink but didn't touch it right away. His gaze drifted toward the window, watching the lights outside blur against the dark. Years ago, he'd taken the gavel knowing leadership meant accepting responsibility for things you didn't always control. Tonight was proof of that. The betrayal wasn't his doing, but the aftermath was his to manage. He finally took a slow sip of his drink, the burn grounding him as resolve hardened in his chest. The Scorpions had underestimated the Blood Reapers by thinking exposure alone would destabilize them. They'd assumed secrets were a weakness. What they hadn't accounted for was what happened when secrets were dragged into the light and stripped of their power. He set the glass down and turned away from the bar, already shifting from reflection into preparation. Tomorrow would bring movement, quiet at first, almost invisible but purposeful. Contacts would be checked, routes adjusted, information leaked strategically. Ryder had no intention of striking blindly. He wanted the Scorpions to feel pressure from every angle without knowing where it originated. Before leaving the room, Ryder paused once more, his hand resting briefly against the edge of the table. This was where decisions were made, where blood had been avoided or spilled based on judgment alone. Tonight, that table had held truth instead of weapons, and Ryder considered that a victory in its own right. He straightened, shoulders squared, and headed for the stairs. The club wasn't falling apart. It was evolving. The past had clawed its way back into the present, but Ryder intended to make damn sure it didn't dictate the future. The Blood Reapers were still standing, still dangerous, and now fully aware. Inside his office, Ryder shut the door and leaned against it for a moment, eyes closing briefly as he exhaled. What Ghost had uncovered didn't just threaten the club's stability, it challenged Ryder's belief that he'd known every fracture in their foundation. Accepting that he hadn't wasn't easy, but denial would be worse. He crossed the room and sat behind his desk, pulling a legal pad toward him and beginning to write. Names, dates, locations. Not because he didn't trust Ghost's records, but because Ryder needed his own framework, his own map of how the past had bled into the present. Patterns emerged quickly once he saw them laid out, missed shipments, strange alliances that had never made sense, violence that escalated too fast or fizzled too conveniently. All of it pointed back to the same route. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and respectful. Ryder straightened immediately. When Diesel stepped inside, Ryder gestured for him to close the door behind him. "How bad is it?" Diesel asked. No preamble. That was Diesel. He'd rather hear the worst clean than have it softened into something unrecognizable. "Bad enough that we can't afford to move blindly and angry," Ryder said. "The damage goes deeper than the Scorpions. What they inherited from inside us gave them years of leverage we should have caught." Diesel's jaw tightened. "And no one's going to pay for that." "Everyone already is," Ryder said evenly. "The question is whether we let it cost us more by reacting wrong." He held his VP's gaze. "I need you holding the line when emotions run hot. Brothers are going to want blood. You redirect that into discipline." Diesel was quiet for a moment, then nodded once. "I can do that." "I know," Ryder said. "That's why I'm telling you first." When Diesel left, Ryder returned his focus to the notes on his desk, adding contingencies and timelines. This chapter of the club's history wouldn't be written in a single night. It would unfold over weeks, maybe months, each move calculated to minimize collateral damage while maximizing long-term security. Ryder wasn't interested in quick wins. He wanted finality. His thoughts drifted briefly to Isla, knowing she would sense the shift even without hearing the details yet. She always did. Ryder made a mental note to talk to her before rumors reached her ears. She deserved truth as much as any patched member, and her insight often grounded him when the weight of command threatened to blur perspective. Ryder stood once more, walking to the window and looking out over the property. The bikes were lined up below, symbols of freedom, loyalty, and consequence all rolled into one. This club had been built on the idea that men could choose their family and defend it with everything they had. That idea hadn't changed. What had changed was the clarity with which Ryder now saw the threats lurking in their past. He turned away from the window with renewed resolve. The Blood Reapers weren't unraveling, they were shedding dead weight. And when this was over, they wouldn't just survive. They'd be stronger, smarter, and far less vulnerable to the kind of rot that had nearly hollowed them from the inside. Ryder gathered the papers from his desk and stacked them neatly, a physical act of control that mirrored the mental order he was forcing into place. Chaos didn't scare him. What he refused to tolerate was disorganization born from emotion. The truth had surfaced, the shock had landed, and now it was time to lock everything into structure. The Blood Reapers didn't react. They executed. He left his office and made his way back downstairs. Conversations quieted as he moved through the room. He stopped briefly at Jack's first. "Rotations start tomorrow," Ryder said. "Nothing obvious, just tighter." Jax nodded. Already thinking about it. He moved to Blaze next. "Keep surveillance on the eastern routes. Don't engage anything. Just log it." "Done," Blaze said without hesitation. At the bar, Cash looked up from his tablet before Ryder even reached him. "Books are clean," Cash said, "but I'll run another layer tonight." "Good," Ryder replied. "Do it quiet." Each exchange was short. Each man walked away knowing exactly where he stood and what was expected. That was how Ryder maintained order when pressure threatened to crack discipline. When he finally reached the bar, Ryder took a seat but didn't pour a drink this time. His focus wasn't on numbing the weight of command, it was on carrying it cleanly. He scanned the room one last time, confirming what he already knew. The club was steady. Bruised, maybe. Shaken, definitely. But steady. That mattered more than bravado or blind confidence. He stood slowly, rolling tension from his shoulders, and headed toward the doors that led outside. The night air was cold and sharp, grounding him instantly. Ryder took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs as he looked out over the property. This land, this club, these men, they were worth every hard decision, every sleepless night, every burden leadership demanded. The past had finally been dragged into the open, stripped of mystery and false loyalty. It no longer held power over them. What mattered now was what they built on top of that truth. Ryder intended to make sure the foundation moving forward was solid, honest, and defended without hesitation. He turned back toward the clubhouse, resolve set deep in his chest. The Scorpions had made their move, and in doing so, they'd forced the Blood Reapers to confront something long buried. That was their mistake. Because the Blood Reapers didn't crumble under truth, they sharpened under it. Chapter 22. Ryder. The first call came in just before dawn, the kind of hour that meant bad news had already traveled faster than sleep. Ryder answered without hesitation, sitting upright in bed as the voice on the other end confirmed what he'd expected, but hoped to delay. One of their peripheral businesses had been hit, not destroyed, but damaged enough to send a message. Broken windows, a torched delivery van, but no casualties. The Scorpions weren't swinging wildly, they were probing. Ryder dressed quickly, mind already moving through contingencies as he stepped into the quiet hallway. Escalation was inevitable once the truth surfaced. The Scorpions had invested too much time and influence to walk away quietly, and they wouldn't risk direct confrontation until they believed the Blood Reapers were destabilized. This wasn't a war declaration yet. It was a pressure test designed to provoke mistakes. By the time Ryder reached the clubhouse, the place was already alive with motion. Phones buzzed and engines rumbled outside. The brothers moved with disciplined urgency, no panic and no confusion. Ryder took that in with a measured nod. Preparation mattered, and the club was proving it had listened and learned. He crossed the floor and gathered the core leadership without ceremony, keeping the circle tight and the tone controlled. Reports came in fast after that, each one confirming the same pattern. Vandalism at legitimate fronts, anonymous tips meant to draw law enforcement attention, a sudden spike in surveillance activity near their routes. The Scorpions weren't trying to cripple them outright, they were trying to stretch them thin. trying to force reactions that could be exploited or documented. Ryder absorbed every detail, filtering signals from noise. He made it clear immediately that retaliation would be measured, no impulsive strikes, and no solo heroics. The Blood Reapers would respond by tightening security, rerouting traffic, and reinforcing visibility where it mattered most. If the Scorpions wanted to escalate, they'd do it on Ryder's terms or not at all. Discipline would be their shield until offense became unavoidable. Ryder assigned Blaze to oversee route adjustments and counter-surveillance, trusting his instincts and experience to spot patterns others missed. Cash was tasked with insulating the books, creating layers between the legitimate fronts and anything that could be used against them. Jax was given authority to increase security rotations, quietly and consistently without broadcasting a shift in posture. Every move was designed to look routine while closing vulnerabilities. As the meeting broke, Ryder felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with the transition from preparation to engagement. This was the phase where patience was tested hardest. The Scorpions would grow bolder if their efforts didn't provoke visible response. Ryder intended to let that happen. Overconfidence was a gift he planned to accept when the time was right. Outside, the sun crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the property. He stood still for a moment, watching the light change, grounding himself in the present. The Blood Reapers had survived worse than broken glass and burned vehicles. What mattered now was preventing fear from becoming a weapon. He would not let that happen. His thoughts drifted briefly to Avery, knowing she would feel the ripple even if she wasn't directly targeted yet. Ryder made a mental note to reinforce her protection discreetly, ensuring Ghost didn't have to fight two battles at once. The club protected its own, and Avery was theirs now whether the Scorpions liked it or not. By mid-morning, confirmation arrived that the attacks weren't isolated. Similar incidents had occurred near their other chapters, spaced just far enough apart to suggest coordination without overreach. Ryder recognized the tactic instantly. The Scorpions wanted to force the Blood Reapers into spreading leadership too thin. He refused to take the bait. He gathered the club again later that day, not to rally them with speeches, but to reinforce calm. Ryder spoke plainly, acknowledging the escalation without dramatizing it. He reminded them that intimidation only worked when it created fear, and fear only thrived in uncertainty. The plan was simple. Hold the line, protect the businesses, document everything, let the enemy reveal their hand. As the day wore on, Ryder felt the tension sharpen rather than spike, a controlled edge that told him the club was exactly where it needed to be. Alert without being reckless. The Scorpions had made their move and the Blood Reapers had absorbed it without flinching. That alone shifted the balance. Ryder retreated briefly to his office, reviewing updates as they came in, eyes scanning maps and timelines. Escalation was a language, and he was fluent in it. The Scorpions were speaking louder now, but their message was still incomplete. Ryder intended to listen until it was finished, then respond in a way that ended the conversation permanently. He didn't bother sitting as updates continued to roll in. He stayed on his feet, moving between the desk and the window, his body mirroring the controlled tension tightening through the club. Every report followed the same pattern. No bodies, no direct confrontation, just calculated disruption. It was restraint masquerading as aggression, and Ryder recognized it for what it was. The Scorpions wanted to look powerful without inviting a response they couldn't control. He called Blaze first, keeping the conversation short and pointed. Ryder instructed him to track patterns instead of incidents, to look at timing and proximity rather than damage. Because chaos could be faked, coordination couldn't. Blaze confirmed what Ryder already suspected. The hits weren't random. They were timed to coincide with deliveries, staffing shifts, and predictable vulnerabilities. Someone was feeding them old intel, or they were leveraging habits the Blood Reapers had grown too comfortable with. That realization hardened Ryder's resolve. Comfort bred predictability, and predictability got people hurt. He issued immediate orders to rotate routines across all chapters, even if it slowed operations temporarily. Profit could wait. Control couldn't. Ryder knew the Scorpions would feel the shift almost immediately, their pressure tactics losing precision as familiar patterns dissolved beneath them. He stepped back into the clubhouse as evening approached, the atmosphere heavier now, charged with anticipation rather than uncertainty. He addressed the club briefly, not with threats or promises, but with clarity. He acknowledged the pressure, he acknowledged the risks, and then he reminded them of who they were. The Blood Reapers didn't fracture under siege, they closed ranks. Every man in that room understood the unspoken order. Watch your brothers, follow protocol, trust each other. As night settled in, Ryder stood outside for a moment, listening to the distant hum of engines and the low murmur of voices behind him. The Scorpions had made their choice. They had escalated without crossing the line into open war, thinking restraint would keep them safe. Ryder almost smiled at that, because restraint wasn't a weakness, and when the Blood Reapers finally responded, it wouldn't be loud. It would be final. Dawn crept in slow and gray, the kind of morning that carried tension instead of promise. Ryder stood at the edge of the lot watching the first shift change roll through. The night had passed without another hit, and that silence spoke louder than sirens ever could. The Scorpions weren't done. They were recalibrating, and Ryder welcomed it. Every pause gave him leverage. He gathered the officers just after sunrise, keeping the meeting tight and efficient. No speeches nor posturing. He outlined what they had learned overnight, reinforced the adjustments already in place, and made it clear that today was about endurance. Visibility would stay high. Routines would remain fluid, and every man would move with purpose, not paranoia. As the group dispersed, Ryder pulled Ghost aside briefly, lowering his voice without softening it. He told him to keep pressure on the information channels, to listen for shifts rather than noise. Escalation always left fingerprints, and Ryder wanted them cataloged before the Scorpions realized they were being read. Ghost nodded once, understanding immediately. Trust flowed both ways now, clean and unburdened. Ryder walked the property after that, checking in without hovering, making his presence felt without suffocating the rhythm of the place. Brothers straightened as he passed, not out of fear, but alignment. That was the difference between command and control. By mid-morning, confirmation came in from the other chapters. No new damage and no fresh intimidation. Ryder gathered the updates, weighed them carefully, and issued a single directive across the board. The Scorpions were waiting for cracks. Ryder intended to give them stone instead. When he stepped back into the clubhouse, the mood had shifted. It was steadier, calmer, and resolved. The club hadn't buckled under pressure. They had adapted. Ryder took a seat at the bar and finally poured himself a drink, not as an escape, but as punctuation. This phase was ending. The next would be decisive. He lifted the glass once, not in toast, but in acknowledgement of the road ahead. The Blood Reapers were under siege, yes, but they were unified, informed, and unafraid. The Scorpions had escalated without understanding who they were testing. Ryder set the glass down and stood, decision settled deep and immovable. The waiting was almost over.
Chapter 23. Avery. Avery woke before the sun, the weight in her chest already there, settled and familiar. The clubhouse was quiet in that suspended way it always was before morning fully claimed it, when even the walls seemed to hold their breath. She lay still for a moment, listening, not for danger exactly, but for reassurance. Silence could mean safety. It could also mean restraint. Lately, restraint felt more dangerous than noise. Footsteps approached behind her, measured and familiar. She didn't turn right away. She didn't need to. "You're up early," Ryder said, voice low and controlled, carrying the weight of everything he didn't voice out loud. "Couldn't sleep," Avery replied, finally facing him. Too quiet. His gaze searched her face, not suspiciously but carefully, as if reading for fractures. "Quiet won't last," he said. "I know," she answered. "That's why I wanted to talk." Ryder stilled, not physically but internally. She could feel it. The shift of attention, the recalibration. Whatever he'd expected from this morning, it wasn't this. Avery met his eyes without flinching. "I'm done being protected by omission," she said evenly. "I need to know what's coming, and I need you to stop deciding alone." The words landed between them, heavy but honest. Ryder didn't interrupt, didn't deflect. That alone told her she'd crossed an invisible line. "This life doesn't leave room for half-truths," she continued. "If I'm here, I'm in it, fully." Ryder studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching. Not tense, but weighted with respect. Finally, he nodded once. "Usually this is not something I would share, but Ghost told me he tells you everything, so I will trust that you can handle it." "And you'd better be ready," he said quietly, "because what's coming doesn't stop once it starts." Avery didn't hesitate. Neither do I. Ryder didn't invite her inside. Instead, he stepped beside her, shoulder to shoulder, both of them facing the waking yard. The first bikes would fire up soon, the sound cutting through the stillness like a blade. Avery watched his profile, the way command lived in the lines of him even when he was silent. This wasn't the man who explained himself easily. If he was choosing to stand here with her instead of deflecting, it meant something had shifted. "The scorpions are moving closer," Ryder said at last, voice steady but stripped of softness. "Not loud, but that's what makes it dangerous. They're probing for weaknesses, watching how we respond to small disruptions." He paused, eyes scanning the perimeter. "They don't want to fight yet. They want leverage." Avery absorbed the words without reacting, though her pulse picked up. Leverage meant pressure points. She refused to let the realization knock the breath from her. "And you think I'm one of those pressure points," she said, not accusing, just stating the truth. Ryder turned to her then, fully, his gaze sharp but unguarded. "You're not a weakness," he said, "but you're still a target. There's a difference." That distinction mattered more than she expected. Avery nodded once, grounding herself. "Then I need to understand the board," she replied. "Not just the pieces you move, but the ones you're willing to sacrifice." A flicker crossed his expression, something like approval and a warning. "I don't sacrifice my own people," he said. "That's why this is complicated." They walked together toward the clubhouse. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from quiet to controlled motion. Maps were spread across the long table, markings layered over familiar territory. Ghost stood with his arms crossed, eyes lifting when he saw Avery enter beside Ryder. He didn't question it. That, too, was new. Ryder motioned her forward, pulling out a chair for her without ceremony. "This is Avery," he said to the room, not introducing her name but her presence. "She's listening in. Anything said here stands." A few heads lifted. A few brows tightened. No one argued. Respect in this club didn't come from comfort, it came from trust in Ryder's judgment. Avery felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, heavy but earned. Ghost began outlining movement along the southern routes, recent sightings that didn't match normal traffic patterns. As he spoke, Avery focused on details, not letting the terminology overwhelm her. She'd learned quickly that listening wasn't passive, it was tactical. Every pause and emphasis mattered. When the meeting ended, the room cleared fast, business done without dramatics. Ryder lingered, hands braced on the table, eyes on the map. Avery stayed seated, waiting. "You're thinking they'll come through the east," she said quietly. Ryder glanced at her, surprised. "Why?" "Because it's the one place you're not expecting them to," she answered. "You've fortified the south and west because that's where the history is. The east looks quiet, too quiet." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, but recognition. "You're paying attention." "I told you," Avery said. "I'm in this." By mid-morning, the compound felt like a coiled spring. Avery could sense it without anyone saying a word. Men moved with purpose, not haste, their conversations clipped and efficient. This wasn't panic. This was preparation sharpened by experience. She stayed out of the way where she was told to, but she didn't disappear. Instead, she watched, listened, and absorbed. Knowledge was currency here, and ignorance was dangerous. "They're still watching the shop," Ghost said. Avery stiffened. "I knew it." "I know you did." His voice softened. "That's why I need you to be honest with me about anything that feels off, even if it seems small." She met his gaze steadily. "I won't hold anything back." That was the closest thing to a promise they could afford right now. Ghost gave her a kiss and left then, going back into the gravity of the club's planning. Avery finished her coffee and set the mug aside, grounding herself before heading toward the shop. The short walk felt longer today, every step echoing with the awareness that she was being watched from somewhere, by someone. The tattoo shop was quiet when she arrived. The clean lines and sterile scent a sharp contrast to the tension humming beneath the surface. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights one by one. This space was hers. The first hour passed without incident. A few regulars came in, men she recognized now, their presence comforting in its familiarity. She worked with steady hands, focusing on ink and skin and the meditative rhythm of her craft. Art had always been her refuge. Today, it was her armor. Late morning brought a stranger. He didn't look dangerous. That was the problem. Clean-cut, neutral expression with polite smile. He browsed the flash art with casual interest, asked questions that sounded harmless but carried too much curiosity beneath them. Avery answered carefully, keeping her tone professional but her words deliberately vague. When he left without booking anything, her nerves didn't settle. They tightened. She locked the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing slowly until her heart rate evened out. Then she reached for her phone and sent a single message to Ghost. Something feels off. Male, early 30s. Too interested. Didn't commit. The reply came almost immediately. Copy. You did good. Stay open. She exhaled, tension easing just enough to keep going. The afternoon blurred into a controlled performance. Avery remained alert without appearing tense, friendly without offering more than necessary. She noticed Blaze across the street more than once, leaning against his bike like he had nowhere else to be. The sight steadied her more than she expected. By evening, the sky got dark, clouds threatening rain. Avery closed the shop early on Ghost's instruction, securing everything twice before stepping outside. The air smelled metallic and charged. She made it halfway back to the clubhouse before she realized she wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed behind her, unhurried but deliberate. Avery didn't panic. She slowed, then stopped, turning just as a hand closed around her arm. Easy, a voice said. Just want to talk. Her body reacted before her mind did. She twisted, breaking the grip, shoving back hard enough to create space. The man stumbled but recovered quickly, eyes narrowing. You shouldn't run, he said. Makes things messy. Avery's pulse roared in her ears, but her voice stayed steady. You picked the wrong woman. Movement exploded from the shadows. Blaze came out of nowhere, fast and brutal, slamming into the man with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. Another figure followed, Jax, silent and lethal. The confrontation was over in seconds. Avery stood frozen as they restrained the man, fear crashing through her now that the threat was real and close. Blaze looked up at her immediately, concern cutting through his usual bravado. You okay? She nodded, though her knees felt weak. Yeah, I think so. Ghost arrived moments later, his expression dark, controlled fury barely contained. He crossed to her in 2 strides, hands hovering like he wasn't sure where he was allowed to touch. Are you hurt? He asked. No, she said. Just shaken. His relief was palpable, but it didn't soften him. He turned back to the restrained man, voice low and dangerous. You don't get to come near her, he said, punching the man in his face. The man laughed, blood at the corner of his mouth. Too late. Avery watched Ghost's jaw tighten, the barely leashed violence in him terrifying and oddly reassuring all at once. This wasn't recklessness. This was protection honed by years of restraint. They moved her back to the clubhouse quickly, the atmosphere shifting from vigilance to lockdown. Doors were secured and orders were given. Avery sat on the edge of the couch in the main room, hands clasped tightly as adrenaline drained from her system. Ghost crouched in front of her, finally resting his hands on her knees, grounding her. This changes things, he said quietly. They're closer than we thought. She nodded. Then we stopped waiting. His eyes searched hers, weighing the truth of that statement. Slowly, he nodded back. Yeah, we do. The club closed ranks around them as night settled once more, the storm finally breaking outside. Rain hammered the roof, loud and relentless. Avery leaned into Ghost's presence, drawing strength from the calm at his center. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Chapter 24. Avery. The road disappeared behind us in a blur of wet asphalt and shadowed trees, the world narrowing to the steady vibration of the bike beneath me and the solid presence of Ghost. I held on the way I always did now, not out of fear of falling, but because it grounded me, because it reminded me that even while everything else is unraveling, this part is real. The night air was cold enough to bite through my jacket, rain misting against my face as we left the glow of town far behind. Ghost didn't speak as he rode. He didn't need to. His body language told me everything. He was alert, controlled, and scanning every curve in the road like it might betray us. This wasn't an escape fueled by panic. It was a calculated retreat, the kind made by people who knew exactly when to disappear and how to do it without leaving a trail. That knowledge should have scared me more than it did. The cabin came into view just after midnight, tucked deep into the trees like it didn't want to be found. Ghost cut the engine and the sudden silence felt loud, ringing in my ears after hours of motion. I slid off the bike slowly, legs stiff and my heart still racing even though the danger felt temporarily distant. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, clean and sharp in a way that made my lungs ache. "This place safe?" I asked quietly. "For now," Ghost said. "No power grid, no neighbors, and no digital footprint." He unlocked the door and ushered me inside, locking it behind us with a solid finality that echoed through the small space. The cabin was sparse but functional. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a narrow kitchen, and a one-bedroom at the back. It felt more like a shelter than a home, and right now that was exactly what we needed. The old version of me might have commented on the lack of comfort, the isolation, and the sheer weight of what was happening. This version just nodded and set her bag down, shoulders finally sagging now that the adrenaline had somewhere to drain. My hands were trembling, and I didn't bother hiding it. Ghost noticed anyway. He always did. "You're safe," he said, stepping closer. "I've got you." The words hit harder than I expected, cracking something open in my chest. I pressed my lips together, swallowing against the sudden burn behind my eyes. "I know," I said. "I just need a second." He gave me that second without crowding me, moving instead to check the windows, the locks, and the perimeter. Watching him move like this, methodical and precise, made it impossible to pretend this was temporary. The scorpions had crossed a line. There was no unringing that bell. When he finally turned back to me, his expression softened just a fraction. "We'll stay here until Ryder gives the all clear," he said. "Could be a day, could be longer." I nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." The weight of that statement settled between us, heavy and unspoken. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about choosing a side, choosing a life that couldn't be half-lived. I had already crossed the threshold. There was no path back to ignorance. Ghost reached for me then, his hands warm and steady as they came to rest on my hips. The contact sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. His thumb brushed the edge of my jacket, a simple touch that somehow carried all the tension of the last few days. "You held your ground back there," he said quietly. "Did exactly what you were supposed to." "I wasn't thinking," I admitted. "I just reacted." "That's how people survive," he replied. I looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw the strain he was trying to keep buried. This wasn't just about protecting me. It was about guilt and responsibility, the weight of every secret he'd ever written down and locked away. Loving someone like Ghost meant loving the scars, too. I reached for him first this time, fingers curling into the front of his cut, pulling him closer until the space between us disappeared. The kiss that followed wasn't rushed or frantic. It was slow and deliberate, a grounding thing that said we were still here and still breathing, still choosing each other despite everything pressing in. Ghost's hands slid up my back, firm but reverent, like he was memorizing the shape of me in case the world tried to take it away. I felt myself melt into him, tension unraveling strand by strand as the reality of the day finally caught up with me. We broke apart only long enough to breathe. "This isn't just about tonight," I said softly. "I need you to know that." "I do," he said. "That's why we're here." He guided me toward the bedroom, not with urgency but with intention, every step a quiet agreement. The cabin creaked around us, the storm outside muffled by thick walls and distance. For the first time since this all began, the noise in my head started to fade. This wasn't an escape, it was a reckoning. The bedroom was dim, lit only by the soft spill of moonlight through the narrow windows. Shadows stretched across the walls, slow and steady, mirroring the rhythm of my breath as Ghost closed the door behind us. The sound was quiet and final, like a boundary being drawn between the world outside and whatever this moment was becoming. Ghost didn't rush me. He never did. He stood there for a moment, studying me like he was committing every detail to memory, as if the act of seeing me fully was its own kind of promise. "You don't have to be strong right now," he said quietly. The words undid me more than anything else could have. I nodded once, my throat too tight for speech, and stepped closer until my hands rested against his chest. I could feel his heartbeat under my palms, steady and sure, anchoring me in a way nothing else could. The rhythm built gradually, each movement deliberate, grounding us both, and the world outside faded. The scorpions, the club, the danger, all of it, until there was only this small room, this shared breath, this moment of choosing each other over fear. I whispered his name without realizing it, the sound pulled from somewhere deep and unguarded. He answered with a low sound that vibrated through me, his grip tightening as if he needed the reassurance just as much. When release finally came, it wasn't explosive. It was consuming, slow burning, and leaving me trembling as he followed a moment later, his weight settling over me protectively. He stayed there, arms braced around me, our breaths slowly sinking as the intensity ebbed. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Ghost pressed a kiss to my forehead, then another to my temple, grounding gestures that meant more than any declaration. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, a tired smile tugging at my lips. "More than okay." He shifted to the side, pulling me with him, wrapping me in his arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. I curled into his chest, listening to his heartbeat as the storm outside finally easing into a steady rain. Lying there, wrapped in his warmth, I understood something with startling clarity. This wasn't just escape or comfort. It was commitment, forged in the quiet space between danger and trust. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, no longer violent but persistent, like the world reminding us it hadn't stopped just because we'd found a pocket of calm. Ghost stirred, his grip tightening just a fraction as he pulled me closer. After we ate, Ghost stepped outside to check the perimeter again, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I wandered around the cabin slowly, taking in the details, the worn furniture, the old books stacked on a shelf, and the quiet evidence of a man who valued solitude and preparation. This place wasn't just a hideout, it was a reflection of him. When he came back inside, rain clinging to his jacket, his expression was serious but calm. "Ryder checked in," he said. "Scorpions are making noise, nothing solid yet." I felt the tension creep back in, familiar and unwelcome. "So this isn't over?" "No," he said honestly, "but we're ahead of them." I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around him, resting my head against his chest. "Then we stay ready." He held me tightly, one hand cradling the back of my head, his chin resting against my hair. "I hate that you're in this," he admitted softly, "that my world dragged you into it." I pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. "Your world didn't drag me anywhere. I chose you, all of you." The words felt solid and unshakable. Ghost stared at me for a long moment, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face before he kissed me again. Slow and deliberate, full of everything he didn't say out loud. The rest of the day passed quietly. We read, we talked, and sometimes we sat in companionable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. The danger hadn't disappeared, but it felt distant enough to breathe around. For the first time since this started, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined solely by survival. As night fell again, the fire crackled low, shadows dancing across the walls. Ghost pulled me into his lap, arms wrapping around me like a shield. I rested my head against his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. No matter what came next, no matter how ugly things got, I know this moment would stay with me. Not as an escape, but as proof that even in the middle of war, love could still carve out a place to stand. Chapter 25. Avery. The cabin went quiet after Ghost's call ended, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful so much as expectant. I watched him pace once, then twice, the lines in his face tightening as information settled into place. Whatever Ryder had said wasn't good news, but it wasn't chaos either. It was opportunity edged with risk, and I could feel the shift in Ghost the way I'd learned to feel a storm coming before the sky darkened. "They're tightening their circle," Ghost said finally, stopping in front of me, "moving through fronts, trying to flush us out." I nodded, already thinking ahead. "Which means they're watching patterns." "Exactly," he said. "They're expecting muscle retaliation." "Then we give them something else," I replied. He studied me for a long moment, eyes sharp, assessing. "You have something in mind." I did. It had been forming quietly since the first day the shop opened, since I'd realized how much people talked when they thought no one important was listening. Art made people comfortable. Ink made them vulnerable, and the scorpions, for all their posturing, were no different. "I can draw them out," I said. "Not directly or obvious, but enough to make them move where we want them." Ghost didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, lowering his voice even though we were alone. "If this puts you in the line of fire—" "It already has," I cut in gently. "I'm not suggesting anything reckless, I'm suggesting something controlled." I explained then, laying it out piece by piece. A flash event at the shop, limited time custom designs, words spread deliberately through the right channels, art that meant something specific to the scorpions without screaming their name, symbols disguised as trends, bait wrapped in creativity. Ghost listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until I finished. When I finally stopped, my heart was pounding, not from fear but from certainty. "That's smart," he said slowly. "Dangerous, but smart." "I know their language now," I said. "Not the violence, but the ego, the way they mark territory. Tattoos aren't just art to them, they're statements." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Ryder's not going to like this." "He doesn't have to," I said. "He just has to trust it." Ghost nodded once. "I'll take it to him." We were back at the clubhouse by afternoon, the compound buzzing with controlled urgency. I felt the eyes on me as we walked in, not suspicion or doubt, but awareness. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was part of the equation. Ryder listened in silence as Ghost relayed the plan, his gaze shifting to me only when it was my turn to speak. I didn't flinch and I didn't soften it. I told him exactly what I could do, how it would work, and where the risks lay. When I finished, the room stayed quiet. "You're asking me to let my secretary's woman walk back into a live trap," Ryder said finally. "I'm asking you to let me use what I'm good at," I replied calmly, "the same way you let your men use what they're good at." Ryder leaned back, studying me like he was recalibrating something he thought he understood. "You mess this up, people die." "So do I said. "That's not lost on me." Ghost didn't speak, but I felt him beside me, steady and present. Whatever Ryder decided, Ghost would back it. I knew that as surely as I knew my own name. After a long moment, Ryder nodded. "We control the environment. We flood the area with eyes. The second it turns, we pull you out." "Agreed," I said. "And Avery," he added, voice firm, "you don't freelance." "I won't," I promised. The plan moved fast after that, flyers designed, words seated quietly. The shop was prepped, not as a battleground but as a stage. I worked late into the night, sketching designs that meant one thing on the surface and another beneath it. Every line mattered, every symbol chosen with care. This wasn't about deception. It was about speaking in a language they couldn't ignore. When I finally stepped back from the table, my hands were smudged with ink, my mind sharp and clear. Ghost watched me from the doorway, something like pride softening his usually guarded expression. "You okay?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything," I replied. Outside, the night pressed in, heavy with promise and threat. The scorpions thought they were hunting. They had no idea they were being invited. The shop took on a different energy once the plan was set in motion, like the walls themselves knew they were part of something bigger. I opened early and stayed late, moving with calm precision, greeting customers with the same easy warmth I always had. Nothing about my demeanor changed, and that was the point. Fear was loud, confidence was invisible. The flash designs went up just after noon, pinned neatly along the main wall, each piece carefully curated to look trendy, organic, and harmless. To the untrained eye, they were just ink. To someone who knew the symbols, the weight of them would be unmistakable. Old marks, territorial echoes and challenges disguised as art. I didn't advertise them openly. I let curiosity do the work. By mid-afternoon, the right kind of attention started to trickle in. Not crowds, not chaos. Just a subtle shift in who walked through the door and how long they lingered. Men who didn't ask prices right away. Men who studied the walls too closely. Men who spoke less and listened more. I logged every detail mentally, each interaction filed away for later. Outside, I knew the club was watching. Blaze leaned against his bike across the street again, posture loose, eyes sharp. Jax moved through the area like a ghost of his own, never lingering, never obvious. Their presence was a quiet reassurance, but not a distraction. I didn't look at them more than necessary. The illusion only worked if I looked alone. One man stood out near closing time. He didn't browse or hesitate. He walked straight to the wall and stared at one particular design, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. I recognized the look now, recognition mixed with irritation. Hookset. "That one's popular today," I said lightly, stepping beside him. "Funny how symbols come back around." He glanced at me slowly, eyes assessing, sharp and cold. "Funny," he echoed. We talked for a few minutes, surface-level conversation that skimmed everything important without touching it directly. He asked about availability. I gave him an opening 2 days out. He didn't book, but he took a picture. That was enough. The bait had landed. When the door finally closed for the night, I locked it and leaned back against it, exhaling slowly as the tension I'd been holding finally loosened its grip. My hands were steady. My pulse was not. Ghost met me halfway back to the clubhouse, his presence immediate and grounding. When we were out of sight of the shop, his hand found mine, fingers closing firmly like he was reminding himself I was real. "They bit," I said. "I know," he replied. "Ryder confirmed movement within the hour." I nodded, the satisfaction sharp and fleeting. "Good. That means they're reacting." Inside the clubhouse, the mood had shifted from tension to focus. Maps were spread out again, markers circling areas I now recognized. My information fit cleanly into the larger picture, and seeing it slot into place sent a strange surge of pride through me. I hadn't just helped. I'd contributed. Ryder looked at me across the table, his expression unreadable but intent. "You did exactly what you said you would." "So did they," I replied. The plan adjusted quickly after that. Routes refined, timelines tightened. What I'd started with ink and instinct was becoming action, and the weight of that settled on me heavier than I expected. I wasn't naive enough to think this would end cleanly. I was realistic enough to know it was necessary. Later, alone with Ghost again, the adrenaline finally caught up to me. My body felt tight, coiled, like it didn't know how to power down. Ghost noticed immediately, pulling me into his arms without a word, letting me breathe against his chest until the tremor eased. "You did good," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "That's what scares me." He held me tighter at that, his chin resting against my hair. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it together." I believed him. Outside, the night settled deep and watchful. The scorpions were moving now, just like we wanted. They thought they were responding to a challenge. They didn't realize the challenge had already been answered. Morning came slow and gray, the sky heavy with cloud cover. Coffee appeared in my hands without me asking. Ghost's quiet way of taking care of things he couldn't fix outright. I drank it, standing near the windows, watching the compound come to life again. Ryder caught my eye across the room and gave a single nod. No praise, no reassurance, just acknowledgement. It meant more than either of those things would have. The rest of the day unfolded in deliberate steps. Messages came in. Names surfaced, routes shifted. My role was done for now, and I understood the importance of that restraint. Knowing when to step forward was only half the skill. Knowing when to step back mattered just as much. By evening, the sense of inevitability had sharpened. The scorpions were circling closer, just like Ghost had predicted. Not striking, but probing and testing the edges to see where the resistance hardened. Each move confirmed what we already knew. They were reacting, not leading. I stood beside Ghost as Ryder laid out the next phase, my hand resting lightly against Ghost's back, grounding us both. This was no longer just his war or the club's problem. It was mine too. Not because I was in danger, but because I had chosen to stand here. When the meeting ended, Ghost turned to me, his expression serious but steady. "You did exactly what we needed," he said. "From here on out, we protect you while we finish this." "I don't need to be protected from the truth," I replied. "Just don't shut me out." He nodded once. "I won't." It was already closing around them.
Chapter 26. Ghost. The moment Ryder gave the word, the board stopped being theoretical. Every name, every route, and every timestamp I'd been tracking slid into alignment like teeth on a gear. This was the part I lived for, and the part I hated most. The instances where preparation hardened into consequence. I stood at the long table with the others, eyes moving over the map without really seeing it, because the real picture lived behind my eyes. The Scorpions weren't improvising anymore. They were committed, and commitment made people sloppy. We split into teams with the efficiency that only comes from shared history. No speeches and no bravado. Ryder's voice stayed level as he assigned positions, trusting that each man knew what the order meant beyond the words. Diesel took point on the western route with Blaze riding shadow. Jax handled containment, quiet and brutal by design. Cash stayed back with me, eyes on the books and the feeds, because the financial choke mattered as much as the physical one. If we cut their money while they reached for blood, the fall would be permanent. I checked my phone once before we moved. One message from Avery sat there, simple and steady. "Be careful. I trust you." I locked the screen and slipped it away, not because I didn't want to think about her, but because I needed that trust to stay intact. The mistake men make is confusing love with distraction. For me, it was focus. We rolled out just before dusk, engines low, routes staggered to avoid patterns. The Scorpions had been probing our edges for days. Tonight, we gave them what they thought they wanted: a window, a convoy that looked exposed, a movement that suggested we were reacting instead of dictating. The bait wasn't ink this time. It was momentum. I rode with Cash in a nondescript SUV, the kind that vanished in traffic. Screens glowed faintly in the dark cabin, feeds split between shop cams, street views, and a financial dashboard that showed accounts tightening like fists. Every illegal operation leaves a shadow in the numbers if you know where to look. I knew where to look because I'd written the rules and then broken them carefully enough to survive. They took the bait at 7:42. A ripple first, then a surge. 3 vehicles diverted to follow the decoy, 2 more repositioned to cut off the retreat, clean and confident but predictable. I watched their paths converge and felt the old cold clarity settle in. This was chess, not rage. Rage came later. "Containment in position," Jack said over comms, his voice flat. "Western eyes on target," Blaze added, a smile audible in the words. Ryder didn't acknowledge either call. He didn't need to. He waited for the hinge. The hinge came when the Scorpions overcommitted. They always did. The moment they believed they'd boxed us in, they tightened too far and collapsed their own exits. I flagged the shift and sent the signal. The decoy peeled away clean, disappearing into traffic, while our real teams closed from angles the Scorpions hadn't bothered to check. The first impact was silent. Jax's work usually was. A van stalled where it shouldn't have, doors opening at the wrong time, men pulled out before they could reach for weapons. No shots, no sirens. The city swallowed the disruption like it swallowed everything else. On my screen, one feed winked out, contained. The second impact was louder. Blaze didn't do subtle when speed would do better. Bikes roared through an intersection with the kind of confidence that made bystanders hesitate instead of interfere. A Scorpion rider went down hard, the rest scattering exactly the way panic teaches you to scatter. That was fine. Scattered men made mistakes. I toggled to the financial panel and executed the lock. Bam! Accounts froze. Transfers failed and shells collapsed inward like paper houses in rain. The Scorpions had been leaning on liquidity to keep their people brave. Spee, I took it away. Fear is louder when the money stops moving. "Pressure's on," Cash said quietly, watching the numbers bleed red. "Keep it steady," I replied. "No theatrics." They tried to counter, of course, a surge of cash through an offshore we'd anticipated, a desperate push to keep payroll alive. I killed it with a keystroke, and felt the weight of 100 small betrayals settle into place. The ones I'd recorded years ago and the ones they'd assumed were buried. Nothing stays buried if someone writes it down. Ryder called it then. Close. The order rolled through the teams like thunder. Containment tightened, roots vanished. The Scorpions ran out of clean options and started making loud ones. Shots cracked in the distance. Sirens flared closer than anyone wanted. As time compressed, we moved. I left the vehicle and cut through an alley, the night damp and electric around me. This was the part where I stepped out from behind the screens, because some endings needed a witness. Their rendezvous point came into view, a warehouse they'd been using as a fallback. I slipped inside with Ryder's team, the air stale with oil and old wood, adrenaline sharpening every sound. They were there, the ones who mattered, faces I recognized from files and margins, men who thought secrets were currency until they realized the ledger was never theirs. The standoff was brief. Words were exchanged and lies were attempted. I let them talk until the truth strangled the room. I told them what I knew, how I knew it, and why it was over. The silence afterward was heavier than gunfire. When it broke fast. Jax ended the last argument with the efficiency of a man who didn't need to enjoy his work to be good at it. Ryder stood tall in the wreckage, unflinching, and for a moment I saw the club the way it had always been meant to be. Quiet power applied with purpose. Outside, the city kept breathing. Inside, the Scorpions stopped. I checked my phone once more before we cleared the site. No new messages. That was fine. I didn't need reassurance. I needed to finish this clean and go home to the woman who'd trusted me to do exactly that. Cleanup never looked like victory. It looked like men moving with purpose while the adrenaline bled out of the room. We cataloged what mattered, erased what didn't, and left the space emptier than we'd found it. By the time we were done, the warehouse was just another forgotten shell the city would pretend not to notice. Ryder split us again before anyone could settle. Momentum mattered. If you let a night like this breathe, it learned how to bite you back. Diesel took 2 men to escort the detained Scorpions to a holding point that wasn't on any map. Blaze peeled off to handle the noise he'd created. Jack stayed close to Ryder, but the quiet certainty of a blade you keep sheathed until it's needed. I slid back into the SUV with Cash and brought the feeds up. The city looked normal again. That was the trick. Violent spikes and recedes, and most people only notice the spike. I scanned for anomalies, accounts twitching or devices pinging from places they shouldn't, those small betrayals that bloom when fear thinks it's clever. 3 lit up. I marked them and let them run a little longer. Letting someone believe they'd slipped the net was often more useful than yanking it tight. When we disconnected, the city felt closer, like it had leaned in to listen and decided to mind its business. I fed one of the anomalies a breadcrumb, just enough to keep it warm. When we got back, Avery was waiting. I wrapped an arm around her and felt the night finally lose its grip. The world outside could keep spinning. Inside this space, the rules were different. Here, stillness wasn't weakness. It was earned. We moved together without urgency, a choreography built from knowing. She poured water. I drank then. She leaned against the counter and watched me like she was memorizing something she already knew by heart. The silence between us didn't itch. It settled. "You're back," she said eventually. Not a question, a fact. "I am," I replied, and that was enough. Later, when the house slept around us, I lay awake and let my thoughts move where they wanted. Avery shifted in her sleep, fingers brushing my wrist like she was checking that I was real. I stayed still, anchoring myself to that simple truth. There were men who measured their lives in territory and blood, and there were nights that demanded everything you had. But there were also mornings that asked you to show up intact. I intended to keep doing that. By dawn, the choices we'd made would ripple outward, invisible but decisive. A rival would hesitate, a deal would die quietly, and someone would wake up with the uneasy sense that the world had changed just enough to make them careful. That was the work, not the noise, the aftermath. I closed my eyes and let sleep take me, not because the danger was gone, but because I trusted myself to meet it when it returned. Morning would come, and when it did, I'd be ready.
Chapter 27. Avery. Morning didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in through the cracks, pale and cautious, like it knew better than to rush a house that had survived the night. I woke before the sun cleared the line of trees, before the city remembered how loud it liked to be. Ghost was still asleep beside me, one arm heavy across my waist, his breath steady and deep. He only slept like that when he'd come home whole. I stayed still, listening to the rhythm of him. Nights like the one before left echoes, even when no one talked about them. I'd learned to hear those echoes without flinching. Loving a man like Ghost meant understanding that silence wasn't absence. It was processing. It was restraint and survival. I eased out from under his arm and slipped from the bed, careful not to wake him. The floor was cool and grounding. I padded into the kitchen and started the coffee, letting the small domestic sounds anchor me. The whir, the click, the hiss. Ordinary things mattered more when the world outside was anything but. The house felt different lately. Not unsafe, not tense, just braced, like it knew something was coming and had squared its shoulders. Ryder's shadow loomed even when he wasn't physically present, and the Blood Reapers moved with that same anticipatory energy. A storm hadn't hit yet, but the pressure had dropped. Coffee in hand, I leaned against the counter and let my thoughts drift where they wanted. I'd learned that being adjacent to power meant you noticed patterns other people missed, glances exchanged too quickly, conversations that stopped when you entered a room, and the way men like Ryder and Ghost spoke less when the stakes were higher. My phone vibrated softly against the counter. A message, unknown number. We need to talk. Today, no name, no explanation, just expectation. I didn't reply right away. I studied the words, the timing, and the confidence behind them. Whoever this was assumed access. That alone narrowed the list. I took a breath and typed back. About what? The response came almost instantly. About what you don't know yet. I smiled despite myself. Games. Everyone thought they were good at them. Ghost appeared in the doorway then, shirtless, hair still rumpled with sleep and eyes sharp despite the hour. He took in my posture, the phone in my hand, and the expression I hadn't bothered to soften. He didn't ask if something was wrong. He asked the better question. Who? Unknown, I said, holding up the screen. He crossed the room and read it, jaw tightening just a fraction. That narrows it, he said. I figured, I replied. They want today. They don't get to decide that alone. I met his gaze. We decide together. Something passed between us then. Not fear, not doubt, but alignment. It was the quiet agreement that whatever came next, we'd meet it on our feet. By mid-morning, the city had fully woken, and with it came the hum of inevitability. I dressed with intention, choosing clothes that didn't announce weakness or invite underestimation. Ghost watched from the doorway, saying nothing but cataloging everything. Ryder called just as we were about to leave. One ring, no greeting. Heads up, he said. You're about to get company. I stilled. You already know. I know enough, Ryder replied, and I don't like the timing. Neither do I. Stay visible, he said, and don't go anywhere alone. Ghost didn't need to be told. His hand found the small of my back as we stepped outside, a silent reminder that I wasn't navigating this alone, even if the conversation ahead would be mine. The meeting point was a cafe downtown, a neutral territory and curated casual, the kind of place people used to pretend they were normal. I arrived 5 minutes early and chose a table with sightlines. Ghost took another nearby, far enough to respect the illusion of privacy, but close enough to end it if needed. The woman who approached didn't look like trouble. That was the first tell, mid-30s, polished and calm with eyes that assessed instead of admired. She didn't ask if the seat was taken. Avery Blake, she said, sitting. Thank you for coming. You didn't give me much choice, I replied evenly. She smiled. Not kindly. Choice is relative. I wrapped my fingers around my cup and waited. Silence was leverage if you knew how to hold it. I represent interests, she continued, unbothered, and those interests are concerned. About me? I asked. About your proximity. There it was. The thing no one ever said plainly. I leaned back slightly. Be specific. Her gaze flicked just once toward where Ghost sat. The Blood Reapers are expanding. That kind of movement draws attention. Attention isn't a crime. No, she agreed, but association can be costly. I smiled then, slow and deliberate. Is this a threat? She tilted her head. It's an opportunity. Step away, create distance, and certain pressures disappear. I didn't answer immediately. I thought of nights like the one before, of silence that meant survival, of a man who came home intact and a family that didn't fracture under weight. I don't step away from people, I said finally, and I don't respond well to pressure. Her smile thinned. Everyone responds to pressure. Then you're using the wrong kind. She studied me, reassessing. Good. Let her. This isn't over, she said, standing. I met her gaze without blinking. It never is. She left without another word. Across the room, Ghost was already moving, already reading my face. The game had begun, whether any of us liked it or not. And this time, I wasn't just adjacent to the storm. The afternoon passed with a strange blend of focus and tension. Clients came and went, oblivious, trusting their skin to my hands while the world shifted beneath them. I worked carefully and deliberately, pouring concentration into every line and shade. Art had always been my refuge. Today, it was my shield. When the shop finally closed, the quiet felt earned. Ghost returned, eyes darker now, mind clearly elsewhere but attention firmly on me. We locked up together, the ritual grounding us both. "They're testing you," he said as we walked, "seeing where you fit." "I don't fit neatly," I replied. A corner of his mouth lifted. "No, you don't." At home, night settled in like a held breath. Ghost moved through the space, checking locks, windows, angles. I watched him from the couch, struck again by the duality of him. The man who cataloged threats with ruthless efficiency was the same one who remembered how I took my tea. When he finally sat beside me, the silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just heavy. I leaned into him, feeling the tension beneath his skin. "I'm not scared," I said quietly. "I just want to be useful." He turned, his expression intent. "You already are, just by being you." I shook my head slightly. "That's not what I mean. I hear things. I notice things. People talk around me because they think I'm just the tattoo girl." His eyes sharpened. Interest, not concern. And maybe that's leverage. Ghost was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Maybe it is, but we have to move carefully." "I know," I said. "I'm not looking to be brave, I'm looking to be smart." He reached for my hand, squeezing it once. Agreement sealed. Later, lying in bed, sleep came in fragments. Every sound registered. Every shadow held potential. But beneath it all was a steady undercurrent of resolve. I hadn't been pulled into this world blindly. I'd stepped into it with eyes open, choosing connection over comfort. Outside, somewhere beyond our walls, plans were being made and lines were being drawn. I didn't know how it would all unfold yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I wasn't walking away. Morning came sharper than the one before. I stood at the window with a mug warming my hands and watched the street wake up. People moved with the assumption of safety, unaware of how fragile it really was. I used to envy that ignorance. Now it felt like a costume I no longer fit into. At the shop, things felt different again. Zane stopped by under the pretense of checking in on some work he wanted done later. His eyes swept the room, casual but thorough. He caught my glance and gave a slight nod. Message received. A man came in mid-afternoon asking about a sleeve. He talked too much, laughed too easily, asked questions that edged just past curiosity. I answered what I could and deflected the rest, my instincts humming. When he left, I noted the time, his posture, the way he'd lingered by the door like he was memorizing exits. I wrote it all down when the shop was quiet. Not because anyone told me to, but because I understood now how information worked, how small details when aligned told bigger truths. That night, Ghost read what I'd written without comment. When he finished, he looked at me with something close to pride. "You're good at this," he said. "I'm observant," I replied. "Always have been." He leaned down and pressed his forehead to mine. "That makes you dangerous." I smiled faintly. Only to the wrong people. Later, as we lay together in the dark, his arm heavy and warm around me, I thought about how much had changed without actually breaking anything. I was still me, still ink and skin and stories told in lines, but I was also more. a participant, a variable. The future wasn't clear. It never was. But it no longer felt like something was happening to me. It felt like something I was walking into with intention. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, we held steady. And somewhere between those two truths, I knew we were safe. For now. Morning came quieter than I expected. I was still at the window with my coffee when Ghost's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He answered on the second ring, said almost nothing, then set it down and looked at me with an expression I was learning to read. "Ryder's calling church today," he said. I turned from the window. "Should I?" "You're coming with me." That was all. No explanation, no preparation, just the steady certainty in his voice that told me this wasn't unusual, or rather, that he was making it not unusual on purpose. I set my mug down and went to get dressed.
Chapter 28. Ghost. Church was louder than usual, not in volume, but in presence. Bodies packed the room, denim and leather brushing, the low hum of voices threading together into something familiar and heavy. I stood near the back wall with Avery at my side, my hand resting lightly at her waist. It wasn't possession, but placement. Everyone in that room clocked it anyway. Ryder took his seat at the head of the table with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. Diesel flanked him, his expression unreadable, but his eyes always moving. Jax leaned back with his arms crossed, while Reaper relaxed in a way that only came from knowing exactly how much damage he could do if needed. Cash had papers in front of him, neat stacks that meant things were already being put back into order. Zane hovered near the doors, and Blaze's presence made a quiet promise that no one was leaving unnoticed. Avery stood straight, chin level, and eyes calm. She didn't shrink, didn't overcompensate. She simply existed in the space like she belonged there, and that mattered more than anything else. Clubs like ours respected authenticity above all else. You couldn't fake fit. Ryder's gaze landed on her first, then shifted to me. It lingered longer than it had in months, maybe longer than it ever had. Having a woman in church is not usual for us. That look is saying, whatever history sat between us didn't vanish just because the scorpions were handled. It waited. Always had. "Before we get into business," Ryder said, voice cutting through the room, "there's something that needs to be said." The hum died instantly. His attention returned to Avery. "You were brought close to this club without consent or context," he continued. "That was on us, on me." A ripple moved through the room. Not disagreement, recognition. "You didn't panic," Ryder went on. "You didn't sell us out and you didn't run. You paid attention, helped us, and because of that, we're standing here without bodies on the floor." Avery didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just listened. That restraint told me everything I needed to know about her place here. Ryder turned slightly, addressing the room. "Avery Blake is welcome in Blood Reaper's territory, at our tables, in our businesses, under our protection." The words landed heavy and final. I felt the shift immediately. Shoulders eased, postures adjusted. The club recalibrated around her presence like it had been waiting for permission to do so. Jax was the first to step forward. He extended his hand with an open expression. "Welcome," he said simply. Avery shook it without hesitation. Diesel followed next, then Cash, then Zane. One by one, they acknowledged her. By the time it was done, the room had decided. Ryder's attention came back to me then. "Ghost," he said. I straightened slightly, meeting his gaze. The old tension stirred, not hostile, just unresolved. Too many years of silence, too many choices made in the dark. "You've carried more weight than anyone should," Ryder said, "and you've done it quietly. I didn't always make that easy." That was an understatement, but it wasn't the time to open old wounds. "You kept secrets that saved this club," Ryder continued, "even when it cost you trust." The room was silent again. This wasn't just about Avery anymore. This was about us. "I should have handled that differently," Ryder said. "I see that now." There it was. Not an apology, not exactly, but acknowledgement carried more weight in our world than regret ever could. I inclined my head. "I did what I thought was right." "I know," Ryder replied, "and so did I. That doesn't mean we can't adjust." The space between us shifted, not erased, balanced. "Going forward," Ryder said, "there are no shadows between us. If something threatens this club, we handle it together." I held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Agreed. It wasn't forgiveness, it was alignment. That mattered more. Church moved on after that. Business discussed, routes adjusted, and accounts stabilized. Cash and I exchanged notes without speaking, years of rhythm making words unnecessary. The scorpions were gone, but the vacuum they left behind would draw attention. We planned accordingly. When it finally broke, the room loosened. Laughter returned, bottles opened, and music bled in from somewhere unseen. Avery exhaled beside me, the tension draining from her shoulders. "You okay?" I asked quietly. She nodded. "Better than okay." I watched the club accept her in real time, the way glances softened, the way no one questioned her presence. This wasn't just my world anymore. It was ours. And for the first time in a long time, the secrets I carried felt lighter. The shift from church to celebration happened without anyone calling it. Chairs scraped back, someone turned the music up, bottles moved from hand to hand like punctuation marks in conversations that didn't need full sentences. The Blood Reapers knew how to release pressure the same way they knew how to apply it. Avery stayed close, not because she needed to, but because proximity was still a language here. Men and women drifted past, offering nods, casual greetings, questions about her work at the shop. The club had made its decision, and now it adjusted naturally. I watched her navigate it all with quiet confidence. She listened more than she spoke, laughed when it was necessary, and she didn't pretend familiarity she hadn't earned. It was exactly how you survived a room like this without losing yourself. Cash joined us with 2 glasses, handing one to Avery. "Welcome to the chaos," he said lightly. She raised the glass. "I've been adjacent to it for a while." "That tracks," Cash replied with a grin. "If you ever want to see the numbers behind the madness, let me know." Her brows lifted with interest. "I might take you up on that." I filed it away. Connections formed best when no one forced them. Across the room, Ryder and Isla stood together, her hand resting easily at his back. They looked solid. Scarred, but solid. Diesel and Lena weren't far. He was leaning in to murmur something that made her laugh softly. It struck me then how rare it was to see these men at rest, not guarding angles or weighing threats. Moments like this were why they fought so hard to protect what they had. Zane moved through the crowd like a current, always aware, always scanning. Reaper stood near the bar, relaxed but ready, never off duty. The machine functioned because everyone knew their role. And now, Avery had one too, even if it didn't come with a patch. At some point, music shifted into something slower. Lights dimmed. Conversations turned more personal. Hands found waists and mouths brushed ears. I felt Avery's fingers curl into my cut, grounding me. "This feels real," she said quietly. "It is," I replied. "As real as this world gets." She studied me for a moment, eyes thoughtful. "You okay?" I nodded. "Better than I expected." Truth was, something inside me had loosened. The secrets weren't gone, but they were shared now, or at least acknowledged. Ryder's words echoed, not as absolution, but as balance restored. Later, when the night had worn itself down to embers, we stepped outside for air. The sky was clear, stars faint but present. Avery leaned against me, her head resting briefly against my shoulder. "They didn't just accept me," she said. "They accepted us." "Yes," I agreed. She turned to face me, her expression serious. "I won't ever pretend this life is simple or safe, but I'm here because I choose to be." I cupped her jaw, thumb brushing lightly along her cheek. That's all anyone can ask. Inside, laughter spiked, then settled. The club lived on, not louder for its survival, just steadier. That was the mark of endurance. When we finally left, riding through quiet streets toward home, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not relief, but stability. For a man who lived among secrets, that was everything. At the house, the door closed behind us with a soft finality. The outside world stayed where it belonged. Inside, the quiet was thick but comfortable, layered with the residue of voices and decisions made. I shrugged out of my cut and set it over the chair, a habit as ingrained as breathing. Avery kicked off her boots and moved toward the kitchen, instinctively domestic in a way that never felt forced. "You hungry?" she asked. "Always," I replied. She smiled at that, pulling things from the fridge with efficient familiarity. Watching her move through the space still felt surreal sometimes, not because she didn't belong, but because I'd spent so many years convincing myself I didn't need this kind of normal. The illusion had cracked, and I hadn't bothered to glue it back together. We ate at the counter, conversation light. Not avoidance, just rest. the kind that came after something heavy had been set down. When she reached for my hand, lacing her fingers through mine, I felt the echo of church again, the moment Ryder had spoken her name, the way the room had adjusted, and the way my chest had loosened. Later, stretched out on the couch, Avery's legs draped over mine, the television murmuring something neither of us was watching. She turned her head to look at me. Really look. "You okay with where things landed?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the years I'd spent keeping myself at arm's length from everyone, about the secrets that had lived in ledgers and codes and margins, about the way Ryder's acknowledgement hadn't erased the past but had steadied the future. "Yes," I said finally. "I am." She nodded, accepting that without digging for more. Trust worked both ways. When we went to bed, the night wrapped around us easily. No urgency, no fear, just the quiet certainty of shared ground. Avery curled into my side, her breath evening out as sleep claimed her quickly. I stayed awake a little longer, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. For the first time in a long while, the weight I carried felt distributed. Not gone, just shared among people who knew how to hold it. The club was stronger, the secrets were fewer, and the woman beside me knew exactly who I was and stayed anyway. That was more than acceptance, that was home. Chapter 29. Ghost. Morning arrived gently, the kind that didn't demand anything from you. Pale light slipped through the curtains in thin bands, warming the edges of the room without fully waking it. Avery lay curled against me, one leg thrown over my thigh, her cheek pressed to my chest like she belonged there by design. I stayed still, breathing slow, letting the moment settle into me. The chaos of the last weeks had burned itself down to embers, not gone, never gone, but contained, managed. The threats were quiet. And in the aftermath, this quiet intimacy felt earned in a way nothing else ever had. Avery shifted, her fingers flexing slightly where they rested over my ribs. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding mine. She smiled, soft and unguarded, like she hadn't yet remembered there was a world beyond this bed. "Morning," she murmured. "Morning," I replied. We stayed like that for a while, exchanging nothing but warmth and breath. Loving Avery had taught me that silence didn't have to be empty. Sometimes it was the point. Eventually, her hand began to move, tracing idle patterns across my skin. Not seduction, not yet, just familiarity. Claim without possession. I watched her face as she touched me, the way her expression softened when she realized I was watching. "You're thinking," she said. I always am." She huffed quietly. "Dangerous habit." "Occupational." She smiled again and shifted closer, her body aligning with mine, heat and weight fitting together like muscle memory. My arm tightened around her automatically, not to pull her closer, she was already there, but to remind myself she was real. The kiss came unplanned and unrushed. Her mouth was warm and tasted faintly of sleep. Her lips moved against mine with a patience that undid me faster than urgency ever could. I kissed her back slowly and deliberately, letting it build without pushing. Her hand slid to my jaw, thumb brushing the corner of my mouth. "This feels different," she said quietly, forehead resting against mine. "It is different," I answered. There was no edge to it, no desperation, no need to prove anything, just connection, steady and sure. When she kissed me again, deeper this time, I felt it in my chest more than anywhere else. We took our time. Clothes came off piece by piece, not discarded but removed. Each touch an acknowledgement. Skin met skin without urgency, heat spreading slowly, deliberately. I memorized the feel of her like this, relaxed, open and unafraid. The way she sighed when my hand slid along her back. The way she pressed closer, not asking, just choosing. When I finally moved over her, she met my gaze without hesitation. There was trust there. "Tell me if you want me to stop," I said, my voice low. She shook her head, hands sliding up my arms, nails grazing skin. "I won't." The way we came together was slow and unhurried, built on attention instead of hunger. Every movement was measured, intentional. I watched her reactions, the way her breath caught, the way her fingers tightened in the sheets. She watched me too, eyes dark, focused and present. There was no rush toward the end. We let it stretch, let it deepen, staying right there in the space where pleasure and emotion blurred together. When she wrapped her legs around my waist, pulling me closer, it wasn't about need, it was about closeness. I kissed her shoulder, her throat and the place just below her ear where she was most sensitive. She gasped softly, arching into me, her hands gripping my back like she was anchoring herself. Maybe she was. Maybe I was too. When we finally came, it did so quietly, powerfully, like a wave that didn't crash so much as overtake. I stayed with her through it, holding her, grounding her, letting the moment complete itself without breaking apart. Afterward, I collapsed beside her, pulling her against me, our bodies still warm, breathing gradually sinking again. She rested her head on my shoulder, one hand splayed over my chest like she was checking that I was still there. "I love this," she said softly. "This?" I asked. "Us," she clarified. "Like this, no secrets, no noise." I kissed the top of her head, closing my eyes. Me too. The world would come back soon enough. It always did. But for now, this moment belonged to us, and I intended to hold it for as long as it would let me. We stayed tangled together long after the moment had passed, the kind of closeness that didn't need movement to stay alive. Avery traced slow, absent patterns against my chest, not drawing anything specific, just grounding herself in the feel of me. Outside the window, the day stretched on without us, and for once, I didn't feel like I was missing something by letting it. Eventually, she shifted, propping herself up on one elbow, studying my face like she was memorizing it, not the surface. The lines earned over time, the things I didn't say out loud. "You're different lately," she said. I raised a brow slightly. "Is that good or bad?" She smiled faintly. "Good. Calmer. Like you're not holding your breath anymore." I considered that. She wasn't wrong. Carrying secrets had always been my default, the cost of being useful in a world like ours. But now, there were fewer locked doors inside me, fewer things I had to keep from the woman beside me. It changed the way my shoulders sat, the way my thoughts moved. "I don't feel alone in it anymore," I said. She nodded like that was exactly the answer she'd expected. We eventually got up, moving slowly and unhurried. The house filled with quiet domestic sounds. Again coffee brewed, cabinets opening, and the low murmur of a radio someone had left, tuned to an old station. Avery moved through the space like she'd always belonged there, barefoot, hair loose, wearing one of my shirts. I watched her from the doorway, struck again by how something so simple could feel so permanent. Over breakfast, conversation stayed light, plans for the day, a few comments about the shop. Nothing heavy. The club could wait a few hours, the world wouldn't end if Ghost clocked out briefly. Still, my phone buzzed once, then twice. Cash. Then Ryder. I didn't answer right away. Avery noticed but didn't comment, just reached across the counter and squeezed my hand once. "Go when you need to," she said. "I'm good." I nodded, appreciating that she never tried to anchor me when duty called. That kind of trust was rare. By early afternoon, I was back at the clubhouse, sliding seamlessly into my role. Ledgers reviewed, messages decrypted, patterns confirmed. Everything looked clean on the surface, but I flagged a few anomalies for later review. Old habits didn't die. They adapted. Ryder stopped by my desk at one point, leaning against the doorframe. "She settling in?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Better than expected." He nodded once. "Good. Club's better for it." That was all he said before moving on. It was enough. When I returned home that evening, Avery was already there. Sketchbook spread out on the table, charcoal smudged lightly on her fingers. She looked up when I came in, eyes bright. "I had an idea," she said, "for a piece, something symbolic." I set my cut down and joined her, studying the early lines. Even unfinished, it told a story. Protection, growth, and permanence without confinement. "It's good," I said honestly. She smiled, pleased but not surprised. I was thinking, maybe someday, when things are really, really quiet. I met her gaze, understanding the weight beneath the casual phrasing. "Someday," I agreed. That night we sat together on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, my arm around her shoulders. No urgency, no fear, just shared space and shared future, tentative but real. For a man who'd spent his life in the margins, this felt like standing in the center of something solid, and I wasn't stepping away. Night settled in slowly, like it had learned to respect the house. The city outside moved at a muted pace, traffic distant, sirens absent for once. Avery sat cross-legged on the bed with her sketchbook propped against her knees, pencil moving in steady, confident strokes. I leaned against the headboard, watching her work, the quiet between us comfortable and unforced. "You know," she said without looking up, "I never imagined my life would look like this." I smiled faintly. "Good or bad?" Unexpected, she answered, but not wrong. She set the sketchbook aside and turned toward me, her expression thoughtful. There was no edge in it now, no lingering fear from the weeks before. Just curiosity and reflection. Growth. She'd walked through fire and come out steadier for it, not hardened, but clarified. You don't disappear when things get hard, she said. You stay, even when it costs you. I considered that. I used to disappear into work, into secrets. That felt safer. And now? And now I don't want to, I said simply. She leaned over and kissed me, slow and deliberate, the kind of kiss that carried more meaning than heat. I returned it with equal care, my hand resting at her back, grounding us both. There was no urgency to it, no need to push it further. What we had already said today mattered more. We lay back together, her head on my chest again, listening to the quiet. I felt her breathing even out, her body relaxing fully into mine. I don't need grand gestures, she murmured sleepily. Just consistency. I can do that, I replied. And I meant it. Later, after she drifted off, I stayed awake a while longer, staring into the dark. The club was stable, the books were clean. The threats had been neutralized, and for once, my mind didn't immediately jump to contingencies or backup plans. It rested in the present, something I'd never been particularly good at before. Avery shifted slightly, murmuring my name without waking. My hand tightened gently around her shoulder, instinctive. Protective and, yes, also grateful. She wasn't a liability. She was a constant, one I chose. Eventually, sleep claimed me too, deeper than it had in a long time. When morning would come, the world would resume its demands. The Blood Reapers would keep moving forward. Secrets would still exist because that was the nature of survival. But they no longer defined me. What defined me now was quieter and stronger. Chapter 30. Cash. Money always told the truth. People lied, ledgers didn't. I sat at my desk with 3 monitors glowing softly in the early morning light, numbers scrolling in patterns only I cared to understand. On paper, the Blood Reapers looked like a modest collection of legitimate businesses with healthy but unremarkable growth. In reality, it was a balancing act, clean streams flowing alongside dirtier ones, all of it filtered, layered, and timed so nothing splashed where it shouldn't. The Scorpions had tried to muddy that balance. They'd come close, too close for comfort, but Ghost Intel had given us the leverage we needed, and Ryder had done what he did best, applied pressure exactly where it would hurt. Now, my job was to make sure the aftermath didn't leave fingerprints. I moved through the accounts methodically. Construction contracts reconciled, bar revenue normalized, and inventory losses written off under believable categories. Every line had a story, and every story had to make sense to someone who'd never set foot in our world. That was the trick. You didn't hide the truth. You buried it under plausibility. By mid-morning, I had the numbers where I wanted them, clean enough to pass a casual audit and boring enough to avoid curiosity. That was success in my line of work. I saved the files, encrypted the backups, and locked the physical ledgers away. Old habits died hard, and redundancy was religion. Ryder knocked once and stepped in without waiting. He scanned the room, then me. "We good?" he asked. "We're good," I replied. "Better than good, actually. The disruption forced us to streamline. Less noise now." He nodded, satisfied. "You always find the silver lining?" "I get paid to," I said dryly. He smirked and leaned against the doorframe. "I've got a meeting this afternoon with some city-connected types. Legit expansion talk. I want you there." "Of course you do." "They're bringing a consultant," Ryder added. "Financial oversight. External." That got my attention. "Name?" "Savannah Lane." I filed it away instantly. External consultants were either a blessing or a liability, sometimes both. "What's her angle?" "Clean money," Ryder said. "Reputation solid. Doesn't scare easy." I stood and grabbed my jacket. "Then we'll see if she knows what she's looking at." The meeting took place in a glass-heavy office downtown, all clean lines and minimalist art. The kind of space designed to imply transparency. Ryder and I arrived on time, which mattered in rooms like this. Perception was currency. Savannah Lane was already there when we walked in, seated at the table with a tablet in front of her, posture relaxed but attentive. She looked up as we entered, assessing quickly. Early 30s, sharp eyes, tailored suit that meant business without screaming it. "Mr. Maddox, Mr. Bennett," she said, standing to shake our hands. "Thank you for coming." Her grip was firm and confident, not performative. Savannah, Ryder replied. Heard good things. She smiled politely. I prefer numbers to praise. I liked her already. We took our seats and the meeting began the way they always did. Pleasantries, context, the dance of legitimacy. Savannah asked smart questions, not invasive but precise. She didn't probe randomly, just followed threads. That made her dangerous if she wasn't on our side. As she pulled up projected figures, I watched how her eyes moved, where they lingered and what she skipped. She noticed margins tightening and understood why. She commented on revenue diversification without prompting. She didn't blink at complexity. You've structured this well, she said at one point, glancing at me. It's disciplined. Discipline keeps things alive, I replied. She held my gaze for a beat longer than necessary, something unreadable passing between us. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. By the time the meeting wrapped, Ryder was satisfied. The city suits were impressed, and Savannah Lane had made it very clear she wasn't just there to rubber stamp anything. As we stood to leave, she addressed me directly. I'd like to go over a few details with you sometime, she said, if you're open to it. I inclined my head. Happy to. Outside, Ryder clapped me on the shoulder. Thoughts? She's sharp, I said, and she sees more than she lets on. That a problem? I considered it. Not if we keep her on the right side of the truth. That night, back at my desk, I reviewed the notes again. The club was rebuilding, stronger, smarter, and somewhere in the margins of legitimate expansion, a new variable had entered the equation. Savannah Lane. I didn't know yet whether she'd be an asset or a complication, but I knew one thing for certain. She was going to matter. The thing about rebuilding wasn't the act itself, it was the scrutiny that came with it. Anytime money shifted, someone watched. Anytime patterns changed, someone asked why. Savannah Lane's name sat at the edge of my thoughts as I worked. Not intrusive, just present. She hadn't asked the wrong questions. That was what bothered me. People who didn't know what they were doing always overreached. Savannah had stayed inside the lines, which meant she understood where the lines were drawn. I cross-checked the figures we'd shared with her against internal ledgers, confirming what I already knew. Everything lined up, clean, boring, and exactly how it should look. Still, I flagged a few areas for further smoothing, not because they were dangerous now, but because they could become interesting later. Interest was the enemy. My phone buzzed mid-afternoon. Unknown number. I ignored it. A minute later, it buzzed again. Same number. Persistence without urgency. I answered. Marcus, I said. Savannah Lane, came the reply. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. You're not, I said, which was technically true. What can I do for you? I was reviewing the projected cash flows from the warehouse acquisition, she said. There's an efficiency opportunity I'd like to discuss. Off the books, so to speak. That phrasing wasn't accidental. Off the books meant outside the group meeting. Private, controlled. It didn't mean illegal, but it meant personal. I'm listening, I replied. We agreed on a time and place, public and forgettable. When I hung up, I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. Ryder popped his head in not long after. You look like you're plotting. Always, I said. Savannah wants another meeting. He raised a brow. That fast? She doesn't waste time. Neither do you, Ryder replied. You good? I'm aware, I said. Yeah, that's all for now. He nodded and left me to it. Trust in this club didn't come from explanations. It came from results. The cafe was half full when I arrived the next morning. Sunlight slanted through dusty windows, catching on chipped tables and mismatched chairs. Savannah was already there, seated near the back, tablet open and coffee untouched. She looked up as I approached, a small smile tugging at her mouth. Right on time, she said. I try, I replied, taking the seat across from her. She didn't waste time with small talk. She slid the tablet toward me, a series of projections already pulled up. Your diversification strategy is solid, she said, but you're underutilizing a few legitimate offsets. It's costing you flexibility. I studied the screen, impressed despite myself. You're assuming growth beyond what we've discussed. She met my gaze. I assume survival requires expansion. I smiled faintly. Careful, that kind of thinking gets people noticed. She leaned back slightly, unfazed. So does stagnation. Fair point. We talked for nearly an hour, dissecting numbers, hypotheticals, and future-proofing strategies. She never once asked about anything she shouldn't, but she danced close to the edge, just enough to let me know she understood where it was. You're very good at this, she said finally, But you work like someone who expects the ground to shift. Because it always does, I replied. She watched me for a moment, something thoughtful crossing her face. I like working with people who plan for instability. So do I said. When we stood to leave, she extended her hand. I think this could be mutually beneficial, she said. I shook her hand, firm and brief. I agree. As I walked out into the street, the city noise swelling around me, I felt the shape of the future adjusting. The Blood Reapers were evolving, not just surviving, and evolution always came with risk. Savannah Lane wasn't a threat, not yet, but she was a variable, and variables demanded attention. By the time I returned to the clubhouse that evening, the sun had dipped low enough to stain the sky in burnt orange and gray. The building sat the way it always did, unassuming, solid, and impossible to read from the outside. I keyed in, nodded once to Zane at the door, and headed straight for my office. The workday wasn't done just because the meeting had ended. I reviewed Savannah's suggestions again, this time through the lens of implementation rather than theory. She wasn't wrong. A few adjustments to the way we cycled legitimate revenue could create more insulation, more breathing room. It would require coordination with Ghost and a slight reshuffle of reporting structures, but nothing that couldn't be done cleanly. That was the part that mattered. Clean didn't mean harmless, it meant survivable. Marcus Cash Bennett didn't gamble. He calculated. Ghost stopped by an hour later, silent as ever, eyes already scanning the spreadsheets pulled up on my screen. He didn't ask what I was doing. He never did. He just leaned against the door frame and waited for me to speak. Expansion's stable, I said, but we've got an opportunity to tighten things further. Because of her, he asked? Yes, I replied. Savannah Lane knows what she's looking at. She's not digging, but she's not blind either. Ghost nodded slowly. Threat? No, I said honestly. Asset, if managed correctly. That's a thin line. It always is, I replied. He accepted that and left without another word. That was ghost trust built on shared understanding, not reassurance. Later, Ryder came in, beer in hand, posture looser than it had been weeks ago. You look like a man with a plan, he said. I usually am, I replied. We're positioned well, better than before the Scorpions. Ryder took a long pull from his bottle and nodded. Good. Club needs to feel that. They will, I said. Stability trickles down. He studied me for a moment. And Savannah. I met his gaze. She's smart and careful. If we keep things transparent where they should be and boring everywhere else, she won't push. Ryder smirked. Boring's underrated. Boring keeps you breathing, I replied. When he left, I shut everything down and locked the office. Walking through the clubhouse, I passed familiar scenes. Laughter near the bar, cards slapping against a table, and the low rumble of conversation that meant nothing was wrong. That was the goal. A club that didn't feel like it was holding its breath. Outside, the night air was crisp. I leaned against my car for a moment before getting in, letting the quiet settle. For years, my role had been invisible by design. Keep the money clean enough, keep the doors open, keep the wolves at bay. Now, things were shifting. Legitimate expansion meant exposure. Exposure meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant people like Savannah Lane entering the orbit. I didn't mind. Change was inevitable. Control was optional, but only if you let it be. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, already mapping contingencies. The Blood Reapers were rebuilding, smarter and stronger, and I'd make damn sure the foundation held. Because if money told the truth, then tonight, the truth was simple. We were just getting started.
Chapter 31. Avery. The shop smelled like antiseptic and fresh ink when I unlocked the door that morning, the familiar mix settling my nerves in a way nothing else could. The world outside had been loud lately, filled with conversations I never used to hear and dangers I never used to consider. But inside these walls, I knew exactly who I was. Avery Blake, artist, observer, and a woman who paid attention even when pretending not to. I flipped on the lights and moved through the routine automatically, setting up stations, checking supplies, grounding myself in muscle memory. The Blood Reapers might now consider me under their protection, but this place was still mine, my territory, my rules. I needed that reminder more than I cared to admit. The bell over the door rang not long after opening, and I looked up expecting one of my regulars. Instead, a woman stood just inside the threshold, sharp suit, composed posture, eyes that cataloged the room the way mine did. She didn't look like trouble. "Are you Avery Blake?" she asked. "I am," I replied, not rising from my stool yet. "Can I help you?" She smiled politely. "Savannah Lane." The name clicked instantly. Cash had mentioned her in passing. Consultant. For the legitimate expansion, I think. I kept my face neutral. "I was in the area," she continued, "and thought I'd stop by. Cash mentioned your work." That alone told me plenty. Cash didn't mention people lightly. "You're welcome to look," I said, gesturing around the shop. "Just no photos." "Of course," she replied. She moved slowly, studying the art on the walls, the framed sketches, the subtle symbolism threaded through almost every piece. She wasn't just admiring technique, she was reading the stories underneath. That made me wary in a way I couldn't quite articulate. "You tell a lot without saying anything," she said eventually. "So do you," I replied. She glanced at me then, a flicker of something like amusement crossing her expression. "Fair." We talked lightly after that, about art, about business, about how places like this survived in a city that chewed up anything that didn't adapt. She never once mentioned the club, never said Theo's name, never crossed the invisible boundary. That restraint was deliberate. "I don't usually mix work worlds," she said as she prepared to leave, "but I think overlap is inevitable sometimes." "It is," I agreed. When she left, the bell chimed softly behind her, and the shop felt quieter for it. Not emptier, just aware. I sat there for a long moment, considering what her presence meant. Not danger, not yet. That evening, when Theo came by, I told him everything. Not because I was afraid, because transparency was the currency now. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until I finished. "She's careful," he said finally. "So am I," I replied. He nodded once, approving. "That's why this works." As night settled in and the city shifted gears, I realized something fundamental had changed. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was part of the equation. And whether I liked it or not, the lines between my world and theirs weren't blurring. They were merging. The days after Savannah's visit passed with a strange, watchful calm, like the city itself was holding a breath it hadn't decided whether to release. I threw myself into work, letting the rhythm of the shop anchor me. Clients came and went, stories unfolding in quiet conversations and careful lines of ink. I listened the way I always had, absorbing without prying and translating emotion into something permanent. Art didn't judge, it documented. Still, awareness followed me, not fear, awareness. I noticed the way unfamiliar cars slowed near the curb before moving on, the way some clients lingered longer than usual, eyes drifting to the door as if measuring exits. It wasn't new exactly, but now I understand the language behind it. Understanding changed things. Ghost checked in more often, never intrusive, never hovering. Just a text, a brief stop by with coffee. I appreciated that he didn't try to wrap me in protection so tight I couldn't breathe. He trusted me to exist inside this world without dissolving into it. One afternoon, between appointments, I pulled out my sketchbook and let my pencil move without a plan. Lines formed instinctively, shapes layered over one another, strength intertwined with vulnerability. A woman standing in the center of intersecting paths, not trapped by them, not defined by them, but choosing. I didn't realize Ghost was watching until he spoke. "That one feels different." I glanced up, unsurprised to see him leaning against the doorway. "It is." He stepped closer, careful not to crowd me, eyes scanning the page. "You look steady." "I am," I said. "More than I thought I would be." He nodded, like that mattered. Like it was a metric he tracked not for control, but for respect. Later, after the shop closed, we walked the neighborhood together. Streetlights flickered on, bathing sidewalks in amber. The city sounded alive but not threatening, just present. Ghost's hand brushed mine occasionally, never grasping, just reminding me we were moving together. "Do you ever miss the quiet before?" I asked. He considered it. "Sometimes, but I don't miss the ignorance." I understood that. Ignorance had a way of pretending it was peace until it wasn't. That night, curled together on the couch, I realized something else. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was adapting and growing. The woman I'd been before this life wasn't gone. She'd evolved. And evolution, I was learning, didn't mean losing yourself. It meant deciding who you became next. The following weekend arrived without ceremony, the kind that slipped in quietly and tested whether you noticed the difference. I opened the shop later than usual, letting the morning stretch before me, coffee cooling on the counter as sunlight warmed the front windows. The city felt balanced, not peaceful exactly, but aligned. That mattered more. I spent the morning finishing the sketch I'd started days earlier, refining lines, deepening shadows, and letting intention guide my hand instead of hesitation. The woman at the center of the piece stood taller now, her posture resolved. Paths still crossed around her, threats still implied, but she wasn't swallowed by them. She existed with them. That distinction felt important. When Ghost stopped by, he didn't speak at first. He just stood behind me, his presence familiar. I felt him there the way you feel gravity, constant and steady, not demanding attention to prove itself. "You're not hiding anymore," he said quietly. I set the pencil down and turned to look at him. "Neither are you." A corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. He accepted that the way he accepted most truths without argument. We talked about nothing after that. Dinner plans, a possible ride out of town soon, mundane things layered over an extraordinary reality. It felt like practice for a future that didn't require vigilance every second of the day. Later, alone again, I locked up the shop and stood for a moment with my hand on the door. The woman who had first opened this place would have been overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She would have doubted herself, questioned her choices, wondered if love was worth the danger. I didn't wonder anymore. Love wasn't the absence of danger, it was clarity in the presence of it. As I walked to my car, night settling in around me, I felt something solid take root in my chest. Not certainty, not invincibility, but resolve. I knew who I was, I knew where I stood, and I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it without shrinking. Because this life hadn't erased me, it had revealed me.
Chapter 32. Ryder, leadership didn't announce itself when you woke up. It didn't sit heavy on your chest the moment your eyes opened. It settled later, in the quiet seconds when you realized every choice you made rippled outward whether you wanted it to or not. I stood on the clubhouse balcony with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, watching the yard below as the brothers filtered in one by one. Routine was a fragile thing. When it held, it meant the world hadn't cracked overnight. The club was stable, but stability never meant stillness. It meant constant adjustment, constant awareness. What left of the Scorpions had gone quiet, which I trusted about as far as I could throw a loaded bike. Silence was strategy. It was regrouping. I headed inside and straight to the war room, maps still pinned on the walls from weeks earlier, notes scrawled in marker that hadn't yet earned the right to be erased. Cash's numbers had bought us breathing room. Ghost's intel had bought us foresight, but foresight only mattered if you acted before the window closed. The meeting came together fast. Officers only, no extras, no spectators. The air in the room was focused and heavy with unspoken understanding. These men had followed me through blood and fire. They didn't need speeches. They needed direction. "We're not reacting anymore," I said, leaning forward with both hands braced on the table. "We're positioning." Eyes stayed on me. No one interrupted. "We've cut the Scorpions down significantly, but the ones that got away will move again," I continued. "Not loud, not sloppy. They'll try to destabilize from the edges, supply chains, allies, pressure points that don't look like attacks until it's too late." Ghost nodded once. Cash's jaw tightened slightly. They saw it too. "We're going to look boring," I said. "Predictable and legit. We let them underestimate the shift." A low murmur of approval rolled through the room. After the meeting broke, I stayed behind, staring at the map long after everyone else cleared out. Leadership was lonely in ways people didn't talk about. You couldn't afford doubt, but you lived with it anyway. You just learned to carry it without letting it show. Later that afternoon, I rode out alone, needing the road and the noise to clear my head. The bike roared beneath me, wind tearing at my jacket, the familiar vibration grounding me. Riding reminded me why I did this in the first place. Freedom wasn't given, it was taken, defended, and maintained. I pulled over at an overlook outside the city, cutting the engine and letting the silence rush in. From up here, everything looked smaller, manageable. but I knew better. Distance changed perspective, not reality. My phone buzzed, unknown number. I stared at it for a moment before answering. "Maddox," I said. A pause. Then a voice I didn't expect. Calm, controlled. "You don't know me, but I know you. This is a courtesy call." Every instinct sharpened instantly. "I'm listening." "Enjoy the quiet," the voice continued. "It won't last." The line went dead. I didn't move for a long moment, phone still pressed to my ear, the echo of that voice settling into my bones. Whomever it was wanted me to be alert, not panicked. Back at the clubhouse that evening, I called Ghost and Cash in immediately. No delay, no filtering. "We've got movement coming," I said once the door was shut. "Unknown source, direct contact." Ghost's eyes narrowed. "Message? Enjoy the quiet." Cash exhaled slowly. "That's not Scorpion style." "No," I agreed, which means we're dealing with something adjacent, or something new. We stood there in silence for a beat, the weight of possibility settling between us. This wasn't fear. This was recognition. The kind that came when a board shifted beneath your feet and you felt it before it broke. "We tighten everything," I said finally. "Not visibly, internally. No cracks." They nodded. No argument, no hesitation. That night, long after the clubhouse quieted, I sat alone in my office, lights low, staring at the city through the window. Being king didn't mean you controlled the game. It meant you stayed standing when the rules changed. And the rules were changing again. Sleep didn't come easy that night. It never did when instinct started whispering before evidence caught up. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying the call in my head. No accent I could place, no emotion I could pin down, just confidence. Whoever it was hadn't needed to prove anything. That alone told me they believed they already held leverage. By morning, the clubhouse was awake before the sun. Engines rumbled in the yard while coffee brewed strong and bitter. Routine carried on, but I could feel the shift beneath it, like a fault line waking up. I watched the brothers move, noting who laughed, who stayed quiet, and who scanned corners without realizing they were doing it. Leadership meant seeing patterns before they formed words. I pulled Ghost aside first. We walked the perimeter, slow and casual, like two men killing time instead of dissecting a threat. "Anything in your channels?" I asked. "Nothing concrete," he replied, "but a few old lines went cold overnight. Too clean. Someone's scrubbing." That confirmed it. "New player? Or an old one stepping out of the shadows?" he said. Cash joined us not long after, tablet tucked under his arm, expression tight but controlled. "I've got anomalies," he said. "Minor, legitimate on the surface, but someone's testing our visibility, seeing what pings." I nodded. 3 angles, same conclusion. "We don't flinch," I said. "That's what they want." The day stretched long, filled with deliberate normalcy. I met with suppliers, signed off on repairs, and settled a dispute between 2 brothers before it turned into something louder than it needed to be. Every decision felt heavier now, measured not just for impact but for signal. What did this say to someone watching? By late afternoon, I rode out again, this time to clear my head the only way that ever worked. The road cut through open stretches where the city fell away and the sky widened. Out here it was easier to think, harder to lie to yourself. Whoever made that call didn't want war. Not yet. War was messy. War drew attention. This was positioning. Pressure without fingerprints, the kind of move made by someone who understood balance sheets and influence as well as guns and loyalty. That narrowed the field. When I got back, the clubhouse lights were already on, dusk settling in like a held breath. I gathered the officers again, brief and focused. No dramatics, no fear. "We operate clean," I told them. "No freelance moves, no chest thumping. If someone's watching, we give them nothing to read." They understood. This club had survived because we adapted, not because we were the loudest in the room. Later, alone in my office, I poured a drink I didn't really want and stared at the city again. Being king meant living with the knowledge that calm was temporary. Peace was earned in increments and lost in seconds. The quiet hadn't broken yet, but it was stretching thin. Night settled fully by the time I finished the last round through the clubhouse, the building humming with low voices and familiar movement. Nothing felt wrong on the surface, and that was exactly what unsettled me. Trouble didn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it waited until you were convinced you'd imagined the tension in the first place. I stepped outside and let the cool air cut through the noise in my head. The yard lights cast long shadows across the pavement, bikes lined up like sentinels. Every one of those machines represented loyalty earned, blood shared, and lines crossed together. Whatever was coming wouldn't just test me. It would test everything I'd built. That was the problem with smart enemies. They didn't bluff unless they already knew the board. Inside, Cash was still up, seated at the bar with a laptop open, numbers reflected faintly in his eyes. He didn't look surprised when I joined him. "You're pacing," he said. "Thinking," I corrected. "Same thing usually," he replied. I leaned my forearms on the bar, lowering my voice. "I want contingencies stacked, not reaction plans." He nodded once. "Already started. Shell adjustments, distance buffers. If someone pushes on one side, the pressure redirects." "Good," I said. "I don't want anything that looks defensive." "Then we stay boring," Cash said. I almost smiled. Almost. Ghost appeared not long after, silent as ever, leaning into the edge of the light. "I traced a partial signal," he said. The call bounced through 2 dead relays in a private exchange, clean and professional. "Corporate?" I asked. "Corporate adjacent," he replied. "Someone who knows how those systems work, someone with money." That narrowed it further. This wasn't a street rival. This was a strategist. Possibly more than one. We stood there together for a moment, the 3 of us forming a quiet triangle of understanding. No one needed to say the obvious. The Blood Reapers had outgrown the kinds of enemies we used to face. Growth always came with new predators. "Keep digging," I said, "but don't force it." Ghost nodded and vanished back into the building. I stayed longer after that, long enough for the clubhouse to thin out, long enough for the night to deepen into something heavier. Leadership wasn't about barking orders. It was about holding the line when no one else saw it wavering. When I finally locked my office and headed out, I didn't ride. I drove. The city rolled past my windshield in fragments of light and shadow. Somewhere in that maze, someone was watching, measuring, deciding when to make their next move. At a stoplight, my phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time, there was a text. Soon. No punctuation, no context. I didn't respond, and I didn't need to. Back at home, I poured a drink and didn't touch it, standing at the window instead. The city looked calm from here, almost peaceful. That was the lie it always told, right before things changed. Whatever this was, it wasn't about territory. It wasn't about ego. It was about leverage, about control without bloodshed, if possible. And that meant the battlefield wouldn't be obvious, which meant I had to be better. I set the glass down untouched and turned off the light, already planning the next steps. The quiet hadn't ended yet, but it was no longer comfortable. And when it finally broke, I intended to be ready. Chapter 33. Ghost. Silence had a texture if you listened long enough. It pressed in behind your ears and tightened the skin at the base of your skull. Tells you when something moved in the dark before sound ever reached you. I'd learned to trust that sensation years ago, back when survival depended on reading what wasn't said. Tonight, the quiet was wrong. Not empty, but curated. I worked from a room no one noticed unless they already knew it existed, with lights low and screens angled away from the door. Data flowed better when it thought it was alone. Ryder's call and the follow-up text had shifted priorities, turning background noise into potential signals. Someone had reached out because they wanted to be seen without being known. That was a language I understood. I traced paths slowly, never forcing a connection, just letting patterns reveal themselves. Dead relays told stories if you paid attention to what they avoided. Private exchanges left fingerprints in timing, not content. Whoever made contact had money, patience, and access. That combination narrowed the field faster than brute force ever could. The first real tell came in the form of a delay, a fraction of a second where there shouldn't have been one. Infrastructure rerouted with intention, not necessity. That meant a human hand, not an automated process. Corporate adjacent was right, but incomplete. This wasn't just a consultant or a financier. This was someone used to operating between public and private authority, someone comfortable shaping outcomes without signing their name. I pulled up historical overlays, letting old data bleed into the present. Patterns repeated when people believed they were unique. The same shell structures, the same timing around municipal approvals, the same quiet pressure applied to organizations that resisted alignment. This wasn't a gang. It was a system. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a count of 5, letting the pieces settle. Fear had no place here. Only clarity. The Blood Reapers had crossed a threshold without realizing it. We weren't just a club anymore. We were an asset, and assets attracted interest. I sent a short encrypted note to Cash. Nothing dramatic, just a flag and a timestamp. He'd know what to do with it. Numbers were his language. This was the part where finance and influence braided together until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Movement outside the room registered before the door opened. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. Ryder's presence had weight. It shifted the air. "Anything," he said. "Enough," I replied. "Not a name, not yet, but a shape." He waited. Ryder understood silence as well as anyone I knew. "This isn't about territory," I continued. "It's about alignment. Someone's been smoothing paths across the city, making resistance expensive and cooperation attractive. And we're not cooperating," he said. "Not yet," I replied. "Which makes us interesting." He exhaled slowly. "Timeline?" "Hard to say," I answered. "They're patient. That's the danger. They don't need to rush." Ryder nodded once. "What do you need?" "Time," I said, "and restraint." He gave me both without question. That was trust, earned the long way. When he left, I returned to the screens, diving deeper now, less cautious, still invisible. The system pushed back gently, like a current testing whether I'd drift or swim. Pressure without violence and control without chaos. I cataloged everything, building a profile not of who they were, but of how they thought. That mattered more. Names changed, methods evolved, philosophy endured. By dawn, I had enough to be certain of one thing. The call hadn't been a warning. It had been an invitation. By mid-morning, the city had shaken off the quiet hours, traffic humming and construction echoing like a pulse beneath everything else. I hadn't moved much. My coffee sat untouched beside the keyboard, cold enough to forget. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't a single operation. It was layered, designed to look like coincidence if you didn't know how to read absence. The redevelopment projects followed a familiar arc. Neighborhoods tagged as underutilized, zoning adjustments fast-tracked, private investors stepping in with solutions that looked generous on paper and predatory in practice. Businesses that resisted found inspections multiplying, licenses delayed, leases renegotiated out from under them. Pressure applied until compliance felt like relief. I pulled records on shell entities tied to the projects, tracking overlap in legal counsel and financial backers. The same law firm surfaced repeatedly, always one step removed, always insulated. They didn't make mistakes. They paid people whose job it was not to make them. That kind of discipline came from the top. I flagged a cluster near our perimeter, not on it, but close enough to matter. Warehouses, logistics hubs, and transit access, infrastructure that didn't scream power until you realized how much depended on it. Someone was building leverage quietly, piece by piece. I sent another note to Cash, more detailed this time. No conclusions, just facts. He'd translate the implications faster than anyone. Then I looped Ryder in with a single line. "They're not circling us. They're building around us." The response came quickly. "Understood." That was all. It was enough. I stood and stretched, muscles stiff, then crossed to the narrow window and looked out. From this angle, the city looked cooperative and ordered. That was the illusion systems relied on. Most people didn't question structure as long as it worked for them. Control thrived in that space. The phone rang once. Internal line. I answered without greeting. "You found something," Cash said. "Yes," I replied. "And no, not a who, a why." I explained it cleanly. No speculation, just connections, timelines and methods. When I finished, there was a pause on the other end. "They want predictability," he said finally. "Alignment across sectors." "Exactly," I replied. "We don't fit the model, too independent and too rooted." "That makes us a problem," Cash said. "Or an opportunity," I corrected. "Depends on whether they think we can be absorbed." The line went quiet again. Then, "Ryder needs this." "He'll get it," I said. When I disconnected, I archived the files and scrubbed my trail, leaving nothing that could be followed back. You didn't win games like this by being visible. You won by understanding the board before the other side realized you were playing. Late afternoon brought movement, not digital, but physical. A city inspector pulled up across the street, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the building like he'd already decided what he wanted to find. He didn't approach, just made notes and left. That was confirmation. I documented it and sent the update. The pressure had begun, subtle but undeniable. This was how alignment started. A nudge, a test. I shut down the screens and leaned back, mind already moving ahead. If they wanted predictability, we'd give them something else, not resistance nor compliance, but adaptation. And if this was an invitation, then the response mattered. Because once you accepted the premise, the conversation changed. By nightfall, I knew one thing for certain. Whoever had reached out believed the Blood Reapers would eventually choose a side. They hadn't considered the possibility that we'd choose our own terms. Darkness settled early, clouds rolling in thick enough to smother the city lights into a dull haze. I welcomed it. Night made it easier to disappear, easier to listen without being noticed. I left the room and moved through the clubhouse with the kind of ease that came from knowing every creak and every blind corner. This place was a machine built on loyalty and routine. It deserved to be protected with precision, not panic. Ryder was in his office. I knocked once and stepped inside without waiting. He looked up from a stack of paperwork that hadn't existed a month ago. Expansion always came with paperwork. They're testing us, I said, closing the door behind me, not with force, with friction. He leaned back slowly, eyes steady. Walk me through it. I laid it out in detail, from the redevelopment arcs to the inspection across the street, to the shell structures looping back into the same small pool of influence. I didn't dress it up. Ryder didn't need theatrics, he needed clarity. They want us predictable, I finished, either compliant or confrontational. Both can be managed. And if we're neither, he asked. Then we become expensive, I replied, but difficult to justify touching. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. That's our lane. Yes, I said, but it requires discipline, no ego, no reaction. He nodded once. We can do that. I believed him. Leadership wasn't about dominating every move. It was about restraint when dominance was the easier choice. When I left his office, I took the long way back, stepping outside to let the damp air clear my head. Somewhere beyond the buildings, the city shifted in ways most people never noticed until it was too late. Power didn't announce itself. It repositioned quietly and waited. Inside, I documented everything one last time, encrypting and dispersing the data so no single failure point could erase it. Redundancy wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Whoever was watching understood systems. They would respect preparation, even if they didn't like it. As the night wore on, the clubhouse settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Laughter drifted from the bar. Engines cooled in the yard. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. This wasn't war. Not yet. This was people jockeying for position. A chess game played with zoning laws and permits instead of guns and knives. The kind of fight that destroyed people who didn't realize they were in it. Because the Blood Reapers had never been predictable. We adapted, we endured, and when necessary, we redefined the terms entirely. Whoever had reached out believed they were setting the pace. They were wrong. We were already moving. Chapter 34. Ryder. Morning came in muted shades of gray, clouds hanging low over the city like a held breath. I woke before the alarm, already alert. The kind of awareness that settled in your bones when the board shifted and you felt it before you could name it. I dressed without thinking, my movements automatic, muscle memory taking over while my mind ran scenarios. Evaluation meant leverage, leverage meant negotiation, and negotiation meant someone believed we could be shaped without breaking. That assumption was both flattering and dangerous. The clubhouse was already alive when I arrived. Coffee brewing, doors opening and closing, engines coughing to life. Normalcy is carefully maintained. I walked through it without comment, nodding where necessary, absorbing the energy. A leader didn't disrupt rhythm unless there was a reason. Right now, rhythm was a shield. I called Cash and Ghost into my office before noon. No urgency in the request, no tension in my voice. Anyone listening would hear three men discussing routine business. Anyone watching would see nothing worth noting. Ghost took his usual place near the window, posture relaxed and eyes sharp. Cash sat across from me, tablet resting on his knee, already 3 steps ahead. This was the core. Not because of rank alone, but because of alignment. We're being courted, I said plainly. Cash nodded. By someone who prefers contracts to conflict. And outcomes to spectacle, Ghost added. I leaned back, folding my arms. Which means they think we'll choose efficiency over autonomy. They don't understand the culture, Cash said. They understand leverage, I replied. Culture comes second to people like this. We mapped it out slowly. The projects Ghost had identified, the inspections, the soft pressure building around our perimeter. This wasn't about shutting us down. It was about corralling us into a system where resistance became inconvenient. They'll escalate, Ghost said, incrementally. Good, I said. Let them. Both of them looked at me then. If they're testing predictability, I continued, we don't disrupt and we don't comply. We mirror legitimacy so well they can't justify the next step. Cash's mouth twitched slightly. We make ourselves boring. Untouchably boring, I confirmed. When the meeting ended, I stayed alone, staring at the city through the glass. Leadership used to mean deciding when to fight. Now it meant deciding when not to. That was a harder discipline to master. By early afternoon, the first domino fell exactly where we expected it to. A formal notice, polite language, a request for documentation already filed and approved twice over, red tape masquerading as due diligence. I signed nothing. I denied nothing. I routed it through legal and logged the interaction, clean, correct, and unimpeachable. The second move came an hour later. A supplier delayed delivery without explanation. I didn't react. Cash handled it quietly, rerouting through secondary channels we'd prepared months ago. The system flexed and held. That evening I rode out alone, needing distance to think. The city blurred past, lights smearing into color and motion. Riding wasn't escape. It was clarity. Out here, decisions simplified. You stayed upright or you didn't. I pulled over near the river, engine ticking as it cooled, and looked out over the water. Control without force was seductive. It convinced people they were choosing freely while narrowing their options inch by inch. Whoever was behind this understood that better than most. When I returned to the clubhouse, night had settled in fully. The place felt steady and grounded. The brothers laughed. Plans were made. Life continued. That was the point. We didn't pause for unseen hands. I locked my office late, the last one out, mind already planning the next phase. If this was a negotiation, then timing mattered. You never showed your hand first. You let the other side reveal how badly they wanted what you had. And they wanted us. That much was clear. The next few days unfolded exactly the way Ghost predicted, like a script written by someone who believed patience was the same as control. Nothing dramatic nor nothing loud. Just small interruptions designed to test our reactions. Permits that needed clarification. A banking inquiry framed as routine and an insurance audit scheduled with excessive politeness. Each move was calculated to provoke either compliance or confrontation. We gave them neither. Cash handled the financial side with surgical calm, answering questions completely while volunteering nothing extra. Every response was documented and every call logged. We were transparent without being exposed, cooperative without being malleable. It was a delicate balance, and watching Cash work was like watching someone play chess on 3 boards at once. Ghost stayed invisible, which was exactly where I wanted him. The less he surfaced, the more pressure built on the other side to reveal themselves. Systems hated uncertainty. People hated it more. Whoever was orchestrating this would eventually push harder just to see what happened. Inside the club, I kept everything steady. No emergency meetings, no whispers behind closed doors. The brothers didn't need to feel the weight of this yet. Panic was contagious, and nothing spread faster than the sense that leadership was reacting instead of guiding. If anyone noticed the increased paperwork or inspections, they chalked it up to growth pains. That was intentional. One night, I sat alone in my office long after everyone else had turned in, the hum of the building settling into something almost peaceful. I reviewed our expansion plans, not to accelerate them, but to reassess. Growth makes you visible, and visibility attracts attention. The trick was deciding which attention mattered. The unknown contact was trying to frame us as a variable in their equation, something to be solved, optimized, or absorbed. They didn't understand that we didn't exist to fit into anyone's system but our own. My phone buzzed again, later than before. Same number. Stability requires cooperation. The message was calm and reasonable, almost friendly. I didn't respond, but this time I didn't ignore it either. I forwarded it to Ghost. The following afternoon, the escalation shifted direction. Not toward us directly, but toward the neighborhood around us. A business 2 blocks away failed an inspection it had passed for years. Another received notice of lease renegotiation tied to upcoming redevelopment. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a demonstration. They were showing us the cost of not aligning. I called Cash immediately. "They're widening the frame," I said. "I see it," he replied. "They're building a narrative." "Then we don't disrupt it," I said. "We let it expose itself." That night, I took a long ride through the areas Ghost had flagged, seeing the changes firsthand. New signage, new surveys, and new interests where there hadn't been any before. The city was being rewritten quietly, one approval at a time. Power like this didn't need muscle, it needed access. When I returned, Ghost was waiting in my office, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "They made a mistake," he said. "Which one?" I asked. "They assumed we'd prioritize protection over principle," he replied, "that we'd move to shield ourselves instead of watching the pattern." I sat, steepling my fingers. And the pattern leads somewhere specific," he said. "One node, one coordinating interest." "Still no name?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, "but soon." I nodded. "Then we stay the course." As he left, I felt the shift settle deeper. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about influence bleeding outward, reshaping things that didn't belong to it. The Blood Reapers had always protected their own. The question now was how far that circle extended. Because once you saw the shape of control, you couldn't unsee it. And once you decided to push back, there was no halfway. The confirmation came 2 days later, delivered with the kind of precision that told me Ghost had been patient for a reason. He didn't knock when he entered my office. He never did when the information mattered more than formality. He closed the door behind him and stayed standing like he wasn't planning to be there long. "It's centralized," he said, "a development consortium operating through 3 holding companies, old money backing, new influence executing." I absorbed that without comment. Old money was cautious. The new influence was aggressive. Together, they were dangerous in a way that didn't leave bodies behind, just empty buildings and erased names. "They don't want us gone," I said. "They want us absorbed." "Yes," Ghost replied, "rebranded and sanitized." I leaned back slowly, letting the reality settle. To them, we were an asset, a culture with reach and a structure that could be folded into something more palatable if stripped of its teeth. "They underestimate loyalty," I said. "They always do," he agreed. I dismissed him with a nod and sat alone for a long time after, staring at the city as if it might answer back. Leadership wasn't about refusing change. It was about choosing which changes you survived intact. We had adapted before, we would again, but not on someone else's terms. That evening, I drafted the first move of our own. Not a strike, not a statement, but a recalibration. I authorized a series of low-visibility investments that intersected with the same neighborhoods under pressure. Cash confirmed the execution within the hour. Clean, quiet, and irreversible. My phone buzzed just after midnight. "We see you're active." This time, I smiled. "So are you," I typed back, sending it before I could overthink it. The response came slower than before. "Perhaps it's time to talk." I locked the screen and stood, the decision already made. Talking wasn't surrender, it was reconnaissance, and if they wanted to step into the open, that was their choice. But they would do it knowing one thing. The Blood Reapers didn't disappear. We evolved. Chapter 35. Ghost. Ryder's text came just before 2 in the morning. They confirmed. Tomorrow. Neutral ground. Ghost read it once, set the phone face down on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling. Avery's breathing was slow and even beside him, undisturbed. He didn't wake her. There was nothing she needed to carry tonight that she hadn't already chosen to carry. He lay still for another 20 minutes, letting the shape of it settle. The meeting was real now. Not a chess move on paper, not a pattern traced through holding companies and inspections, but a room, a table, and a face attached to the hands that had been quietly rearranging the city around them. Ghost had spent weeks building the intelligence that made this possible. Now, Ryder would walk through the door he'd unlocked, and Ghost's job shifted from discovery to protection. He got up without disturbing the sheets, pulled on clothes in the dark, and went to work. By 4, the profile was complete. 3 holding companies folded into a single coordinating interest, old money, generational, the kind that wore legitimacy the way the Blood Reapers wore leather. The execution arm was newer and more aggressive. hired muscle with law degrees instead of fists. Ghost had seen the type before. They didn't leave bodies, they left paperwork. Liens, notices, and ordinances, inspections that passed for years suddenly didn't. It was violence with a signature line, and in some ways, it was harder to fight than the Scorpions had ever been. At least the Scorpions bled. He compiled everything into a document Ryder could carry into the meeting without looking like he'd prepared, which was the point. You never wanted the other side to know how much you already knew. You let them talk. You let them believe they were the ones revealing the shape of things, and while they laid out their offer, you were already 3 moves ahead. Ghost sent the file to Ryder with a single line. Everything you need. Don't mention the Mercer connection until they do. The response came back in under a minute. Understood. Ghost locked the file and leaned back in his chair. The clubhouse was quiet at this hour. Not empty, never entirely empty, but quiet in the way it got when the night had burned itself out and the morning hadn't yet made its demands. He listened to it, the familiar hum of the building settling, the distant sound of someone moving in the kitchen, the low idle of a bike in the lot. This was home. He thought about what Ryder had said to him weeks ago, the acknowledgement that had landed heavier than any formal statement could have. The burden is shared, whether spoken or not. Ghost had carried the club's secrets for so long that sharing them had felt like exposure and a weakness, but it wasn't. He understood that now in a way that wasn't abstract. The weight hadn't disappeared when he handed pieces of it to Ryder, to Cash, or to Avery. It had become something the structure could hold instead of something one man had to carry in the dark. He pulled up the secondary files, the ones he'd been running in parallel since the consortium began making noise in the neighborhoods. Cash had flagged something 3 days ago, a routine trucking subsidiary audit that had crossed Ghost's desk unremarked at the time. He had logged it, cataloged the firm, Lane and Associates, and moved on. Now he looked at it again more carefully. The timing was suspicious. It always was with these people. The audit was framed as a standard state compliance review, but the firm was private, contracted, and the lead auditor attached to the file, Savannah Lane, had a reputation that made Ghost slow down and read twice. Clean didn't begin to cover it. The woman had never failed to deliver a complete and accurate report, never had a finding reversed, never been implicated in the kind of quid pro quo that made auditors manageable. She was, by every account he could find, exactly what she appeared to be. That made her more dangerous than half the men who'd come at them with open hostility. Ghost added a notation to the file and flagged it for Cash. Lane and Associates, lead auditor, Savannah Lane, background attached. Suggest you read this before the audit begins. She's not the usual kind of problem. He sent it, then sat for a moment with the cursor blinking in the empty message field. Cash would know what to do with it. He had been running the books with the kind of precision that made Ghost's own work look casual by comparison. Layers inside layers. Legitimate revenue timed and structured to absorb scrutiny without offering anything useful. If anyone could navigate a sharp-eyed auditor without exposing the real architecture, it was Cash. But it would require his full attention. And Cash didn't always give things his full attention until they'd already gotten complicated. Ghost made a note to follow up in person. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. That particular gray that came before the city remembered it was supposed to be loud. He closed down the secondary files and checked his phone one more time. No new messages from Ryder, no movement on the consortium's end that his network would have flagged. The morning was clean, which was either genuine or deliberate, and Ghost no longer assumed the difference without evidence. He thought about the Scorpions, how that threat had announced itself in violence, in heat, and in the kind of pressure that left marks you could photograph. The threat they were navigating now was the opposite. It was patient, institutional, and the kind that smiled in conference rooms while tightening its grip one regulatory filing at a time. Defeating it would require a different kind of discipline. Not the club's physical strength or even Ghost's intelligence work alone, but the legitimacy they'd spent years building. The businesses that actually functioned, the financials that could survive scrutiny, and the relationships with people like Cash who understood how power moved through money as clearly as Ryder understood how it moved through loyalty. The Scorpion era was over. This was something else entirely. Ghost stood, stretched the tension from his shoulders, and went to the window. The lot below was mostly quiet with bikes sitting dark in the early light. One set of headlights was moving. Someone headed out early, with purpose in the way they pulled past the gate without hesitation. He tracked it until it disappeared, cataloged it without alarm, and let it go. He checked his watch. The meeting was in 4 hours. Ryder would ride in alone as agreed, which meant Ghost would be close but not visible. That was his role. It has always been his role, the one who saw the whole board while others saw only their piece. He'd stopped resenting it somewhere along the way, when it stopped feeling like isolation and started feeling like trust. He walked back to the bedroom, moving quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed. Avery stirred without waking, shifted toward him out of some instinct she probably didn't know she had. Her hand found his arm and rested there. The contact was light, but unconscious. It anchored him in a way nothing else did. He covered her hand with his, just briefly, then set her fingers gently back against the sheet. She'd asked him once, early on, what it was like to know so much and be able to say so little. He hadn't answered at the time. He hadn't known how to. But sitting here now, with the morning coming in and a meeting 4 hours away with a new thread already taking shape in the margins of the old one, he thought the answer was simpler than he'd made it. It was lonely until it wasn't, and it hadn't been for a while. He stood, picked up his phone, and went back to his desk. There was still work to do before Ryder walked into that room. The Mercer connection needed to be airtight, and the notation on Savannah Lane needed a full brief, not just a flag. The consortium's most recent filing, the one Ghost had pulled at midnight and not yet fully cross-referenced, was waiting. He opened the file and got to work. Whatever walked through the gate this morning, the Blood Reapers would be ready for it. Not because they had more force or more resources or more connections than the people pressing against them, but because they had this, the quiet, unglamorous, relentless work of knowing more than they were supposed to. And Ghost had never been better at anything in his life. Epilogue. Ghost. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Ryder came back without a word about what was said, which told me everything I needed to know. The consortium had walked in expecting negotiation and found a wall. By the following week, the inspections stopped. The notices dried up and the soft pressure that had been building around our perimeter for months simply withdrew, the way water finds another path when the ground holds firm. I watched it happen line by line in the filings, the same way I'd watched it build, and I noted it in the ledger with the same precision I gave everything else. Closed. For now. Cash handled the audit quietly, the way Cash handled everything that mattered. Whatever Savannah Lane found in the books, she signed off clean, and whatever happened between them in the process was his story to tell, not mine. I flagged it and stepped back. That was my role. It always has been. Time didn't slow after the pressure eased. It rarely did. It simply shifted, settling into a new rhythm that carried the weight of what had almost happened and the quiet satisfaction of what hadn't. The city kept moving, the club kept breathing, and the hands that tried to shape us learned, slowly and expensively, that some structures didn't bend without consequences. The influence never vanished completely. Power like that didn't disappear. It recalculated. Lines were redrawn farther from our gates, interests realigned, and conversations happened behind closed doors, where our name came up less frequently and with more caution. That was the win. The Blood Reapers held steady. No fractures, no betrayals. The brothers adapted the way they always had, with loyalty instead of noise. Business stayed clean, territory stayed ours, and the silence that followed wasn't the dangerous kind. Avery changed the most, though she'd argue otherwise. She moved with intention now, not fear. Awareness sat on her like armor instead of weight. She didn't ask to be shielded, and she didn't demand answers she didn't need. She stood beside me like someone who understood the cost of proximity and chose it anyway. That mattered more than she knew. Some nights I still stood on the balcony and watched the city, cigarette burning down between my fingers as I listened to the distant hum of engines and life. Leadership didn't end. Vigilance didn't fade. But it no longer felt like standing on a fault line waiting for the ground to split. It felt like balance reclaimed. We were no longer being tested. We had been measured and found immovable. The Blood Reapers weren't untouchable. Nothing was. But we were anchored, rooted too deeply to be erased quietly, too unified to be absorbed, too aware to be controlled. That was the lesson they learned, and the one we would never forget. You have been listening to Inked in Secret Book 4 in the Blood Reapers MC series. Please like, subscribe, and share for more. As always, we love to hear your feedback, so drop us some gems in the comments, and we will see you in the next one. The end.